Good evening, my friends. It is September 6th, 2025, here in Paris, the very city where our story unfolded a century ago. Tonight, the boulevards still glow with warm cafe lights, and the faint echo of jazz drifts from hidden corners. Yet, as we stand in the present, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what once happened in these same streets. The glitter of 1920s Paris dazzled the world, but behind its radiance was a quieter, more fragile story marked by the shadow of heroin. What we inherit today is not just the music and the glamour, but also the silences left by artists who could not escape the grasp of addiction. We begin not with the excitement of the roaring 20s, but with the consequence that lingered long after the last saxophone note faded. Cemeteries across Paris hold the names of men and women who lived through that era and succumbed to early. Jean Cocteau, though he survived, left behind harrowing accounts of his dependence, writing of trembling nights and desperate mornings. Others, whose names never reached the history books, left their dreams unfinished, songs unwritten, canvases left blank, poems lost in the haze of dependency. The legacy of heroin in Paris is measured not only in deaths, but also in absences, in the art that never reached us. To understand how this shadow grew, we must return to the heart of 1920s Montmartre and Montparnasse. These neighborhoods pulsed with life as Paris welcomed a generation of expatriates and dreamers. At the Folies Burger, Josephine Baker danced with a brilliance that still feels alive in photographs, her movements lit by golden spotlights and the clapping of enchanted audiences in smoky clubs. American jazz musician Sidney Bechet among them brought rhythms that set the city on fire. Ernest Hemingway wrote in cafes on the left bank, while F. Scott Fitzgerald, forever chasing both beauty and despair, sought inspiration in the same crowded rooms. The city was a carnival of creativity, a beacon for all who felt restless after the Great War. But alongside champagne flutes and syncopated rhythms came another offering: heroin. At first, it appeared as just one more indulgence, a fashionable experiment, much like absinthe or opium. Pharmacists in Saint-Germain discreetly sold vials, while in back rooms of clubs, the drug passed silently from hand to hand. For a restless generation that craved intensity, heroin seemed to promise clarity, energy, or a soft landing after long nights. Few recognized the cost until it was too late. Artists were especially vulnerable. Jean Cocteau's journals tell us of the strange seduction, the illusion of control, the lie that heroin would sharpen the imagination or ease the pain of creation. For some musicians, it dulled exhaustion and kept them playing deep into the night. Yet soon, the brilliance dulled. Hands shook, performances faltered, canvases remained unfinished. Friends whispered of decline even as the city above them celebrated. The tragedy was that Paris's brightest stars were dimmed not only by time, but by the very substance they thought would fuel their art. The circle extended beyond the salons of artists. Heroin flowed through aristocratic parties, backstage dressing rooms, and the cramped boarding houses of Latin Quarter students. The young experimented recklessly, while the wealthy treated the drug as another thrill among many. The police, preoccupied with the turbulence of nightlife, largely ignored it to the wider world. Paris remained the city of light, a paradise of freedom. But inside its veins, a quiet dependency spread, shaping lives far removed from the glamour of the postcards dot by the end of the decade. The illusion cracked. Newspapers reported arrests. Scandals whispered of collapsed performers, and critics noted the exhaustion in once brilliant talents. Even as the Great Depression loomed, Paris had already learned that glitter always hides shadow. A century later, as we walk these streets, we remember both sides of that legacy: the joyous explosion of jazz and art, and the fragile cost hidden beneath. This is the story of heroin, jazz, and the glitter of 1920s Paris. A story that begins with brilliance and ends in silence. As we unfold its chapters, we will step into the smoky clubs, follow the artists who reached for something beyond themselves, and watch how a city's brightest era carried within it a quiet ruin. Don't forget to subscribe to support this journey and follow along for the next chapters. The story of heroin in 1920s Paris is best understood not at the dazzling beginning of the decade, but at its weary and heavy end. To walk through the Paris of today is to encounter echoes of that earlier age, hidden not in the bright cafes or polished boulevards, but in the somber stillness of the cemeteries that border the city. Père Lachaise, Montmartre, and Montparnasse are not merely resting places for the famous. They are vast archives of stories cut short, of voices silenced, of young men and women who arrived with hope and left only their names in stone. Step onto the cobblestones of Père Lachaise on a cool September morning, and you feel the uneven stones beneath your shoes, worn smooth by decades of visitors. The air carries a mixture of scent-damp moss, fallen leaves, and the faint sweetness of candle wax left burning in memory of the departed. Here the past is never entirely gone. It lingers like the smoke that curls from extinguished flames. The visitor's eyes are drawn to the grand tombs of celebrated figures: Chopin, Proust, Oscar Wilde. But scattered among these monuments are smaller markers, modest crosses, and crumbling slabs where the inscriptions are barely legible. These belong to the forgotten actors who once filled the cabarets with laughter, the musicians whose trumpets once carried the pulse of jazz, the students who scribbled poems on cafe napkins but never lived long enough to bind them into books. Many of these young lives ended not through war or famine, but through a quieter, more insidious enemy: heroin. In the bright years of Parisian modernity, heroin was not yet a substance of universal condemnation. It was sold discreetly in pharmacies on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, prescribed as medicine by doctors who saw it as a more refined cousin of morphine. To the restless, it was a fashionable indulgence, a curious experiment. For artists, it was believed to be a doorway to sharper visions and deeper sensations. Yet the cemetery records remind us that such indulgence bore a heavy toll. Behind each fading name is a story of nights that began with laughter and ended in silence. What was lost cannot be measured only in human years. It was also a loss of possibilities, of unwritten art. Think of the saxophonist who, after nights of brilliance in the smoky clubs of Montmartre, could no longer hold his instrument steady. His music, once capable of igniting an entire room, gave way to trembling silence. Think of the actress who performed under glittering lights, her beauty adored by the crowd, only to fade backstage into dependence. Her career ended not with a farewell performance, but with a quiet withdrawal from the stage, her name erased from the posters. Think of the poet who believed the drug would open doors to new rhythms, only to find that the very act of holding a pen became unbearable. These lives were not simply shortened, they were interrupted, and their art abandoned like unfinished canvases in a studio where the paint has dried. Jean Cocteau, among the rare survivors, offered us glimpses into this shadowed world. In his journals, one can almost hear the trembling of his hands as he described mornings filled with dread, and nights when light itself seemed an unbearable burden. He called heroin a false friend, a chain invisible to others yet suffocating to the soul. His honesty gives us an understanding of what countless others endured silently. For every Cocteau who lived long enough to confess and recover, there were dozens whose names did not survive the century. The silence of the cemeteries becomes, in this way, a kind of testimony. Each moss-covered stone speaks to us not in words, but in absence. The unwritten symphonies, the unpainted portraits, the novels never finished tall are buried here as surely as the bodies themselves. One might say that Paris lost not only individuals, but also entire worlds of imagination. Possibilities that vanished like candlelight extinguished by a draught. As we linger among these graves, it becomes clear that the city's celebrated brilliance was always accompanied by its shadows. The golden cabaret lights that dazzled the visitors from abroad were fueled by fragile lives, and those who applauded the glamour rarely saw the cost. Behind the music of Sidney Beckett, behind the dancing figure of Josephine Baker, behind the prose of Hemingway and Fitzgerald, there were hundreds of lesser-known dreamers who sought the same spark and were undone by the same flame. The Seine flows not far from these resting places. At night, it reflects the city lights, shimmering with a beauty that hides its depth and darkness. In the same way, Paris of the 1920s dazzled with music, champagne, and laughter, even while the shadow of heroin crept silently through its veins. To begin our story here, in the cemetery, is to acknowledge the true cost before we return to the glitter. It is to listen, not to the noise of jazz, but to the hush of forgotten voices that once sought meaning in the same streets we walk today. The cemeteries are not places of despair alone. They are also places of memory, of contemplation. As you walk past the crumbling statues, you may notice small tokens left behind by strangers' pebbles, folded notes, even fragments of poems written by modern admirers who never met the dead. In these gestures, the living acknowledge the unfinished. They sense, perhaps, that in the silence of those who could not continue lies a lesson for us who remain. It is a lesson about brilliance and fragility, about how closely creation and destruction can walk together, and about the responsibility of remembering those whom history would otherwise let fade. This is the ground upon which we begin our story, not in the glitter of Montmartre, not in the laughter of cabaret halls, but in the still air of Parisian cemeteries, where every step reminds us that the most radiant eras carry their shadows. Before we step into the clubs and cafes, before we hear the music and see the glamour, we must first acknowledge this silence, the quiet ruin behind the glitter. If the cemeteries of Paris remind us of the silence left behind, Montmartre in the early 1920s reveals the noise that preceded it. To walk through those narrow streets then was to be enveloped in a spectacle of sound, scent, and color. Cabaret doors opened wide, releasing clouds of smoke and bursts of laughter. Gas lamps cast yellow halos onto cobblestones slick with evening rain. The air carried the mingled aromas of roasting chestnuts, spilled wine, cheap tobacco, and the faint perfume of dancers passing by in feathered costumes. Montmartre, once a quiet hilltop village of windmills and vineyards, had by this time transformed into the beating heart of Bohemian Paris. The scars of the Great War still haunted Europe. But here the war felt distant, almost forgotten. Jazz poured from every doorway, its syncopated rhythms brought by African-American musicians who had crossed the Atlantic in search of respect they were denied at home. Their music electrified the city. The saxophones wail, the trumpets call. The piano's syncopated chords all seemed to mirror the restless energy of a generation. Unwilling to return to silence after years of loss, Josephine Baker arrived. In 1925, her presence a revelation. Her dance, at once playful and defiant, drew audiences into a frenzy. At the Foley's Burger, the lights dimmed and then burst alive as she appeared, adorned in a costume of feathers or pearls. Her movements, radiating a freedom the crowd longed for. The applause shook the theater, while in the shadows of the balcony, critics scribbled notes and artists sketched her silhouette, hoping to capture a fraction of her energy. She was not alone. Across the quarter, dancers, singers, and comedians filled halls with vitality. The nights belonged to spectacle. Writers gathered in cafes to exchange words like gamblers throwing dice. Ernest Hemingway, still struggling for recognition, sat in smoky corners with a notebook, his sentences as sharp as the knife he once carried from war. F. Scott Fitzgerald, always balancing between brilliance and despair, wandered between tables, his laughter covering the unease beneath. Painters from every corner of Europe filled their canvases with bold colors, seeking to outdo one another in originality. It was a carnival of creativity, as if the entire quarter had agreed to live as intensely as possible, uncertain of how long peace and prosperity would last. Yet beneath this brilliance, another rhythm pulsed. In back rooms behind the clubs, in the private apartments above cafes, heroin circulated quietly. At first, it was spoken of in hushed tones, like a secret too precious to share with everyone. Some obtained it from sympathetic pharmacists on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, others from acquaintances who carried small vials discreetly in their pockets. Too many, it seemed like another indulgence, no more dangerous than the absinthe served in green glass or the opium smoked in hidden dens. After all, had not artists for centuries sought inspiration in substances that altered the senses? The appeal of heroin lay in its deceptive promise for the exhausted musician. It offered a sudden ease, a sense that fatigue could be lifted like a coat from weary shoulders. For the anxious writer, it whispered of clarity, of words flowing, more freely, of nights made bearable when the silence of the page became unbearable. For dancers and actors, it seemed to grant a kind of serenity, smoothing the nerves before stepping into the blinding lights of the stage. At first, it was difficult to see the cost. A young saxophonist might play all night, his music fevered and unrelenting, and the audience would leave believing they had witnessed genius. A painter, staying awake for days, might produce canvases filled with strange, luminous shapes, admired by critics for their daring. The drug seemed to feed the hunger for intensity that defined Montmartre's spirit. It was, in its early days, the secret ally of a city determined to live louder than death. But like all false friends, Heroin's embrace tightened over time. The brilliant performances grew inconsistent. The painter's hand, once bold, began to tremble. The writer, who had filled pages with urgency, now left blank sheets on the cafe table, staring at them with hollow eyes. Yet the city, drunk on its own brilliance, did not notice at first. The music still played, the dancers still spun, and the champagne still flowed. The decline was quiet, hidden in the shadows of bright stages and crowded boulevards. Walking through Montmartre in those years, one might have passed by a struggling artist without realizing the depth of their battle. Outwardly, the quarter sparkled. Posters announced new plays, new performances, new exhibitions. Tourists from America and England marveled at the freedom of the place, the daring of its art, the heat of its nights. They returned home with tales of Paris as a paradise, unaware that the very figures they admired were, in private, slowly unraveling. Heroin was not the only indulgence of the time. Absinthe, long associated with Parisian decadence, still flowed freely. Opium dens attracted the curious, promising exotic visions. Wine, champagne, and cognac soaked every celebration. Yet heroin was different. Its power was quieter, its presence harder to detect. It slipped into lives not with the violence of alcohol's brawls or the loud scandal of drunkenness, but with a steady, relentless grip. By the time its victims realized the danger, it had already claimed their nights and begun to erode their days. The atmosphere of Montmartre in the 1920s is remembered today as a golden age. Photographs show crowds of revelers smiling beneath strings of lights. Musicians lost in their instruments, dancers caught mid-motion. Yet the photographs, like postcards, capture only one angle. They do not reveal the exhaustion that followed, the dependency growing silently behind closed doors. They do not show the trembling hands of the pianist in the morning, or the actress who wept alone in her dressing room. To recall Montmartre only as a place of joy is to forget the complexity of human life, for joy was there, abundant and undeniable. But so too were the shadows that crept in, shadows that offered relief at first, but demanded a price no one could pay. The near cause of the quiet ruin we later encounter in the cemeteries lies here. In these glittering nights, in the indulgences mistaken for freedom, in the choices made under the music and lights, Montmartre's promise was always double-edged. It gave art, laughter, and a sense of liberation to a weary world. But it also gave illusions, and among the strongest of these was the belief that heroin was simply another path to brilliance. The truth, revealed only in hindsight, was that the brilliance it promised was always borrowed, and the debt it demanded was too great for most to repay. This is why the cemeteries and Montmartre belong together in our story. The silence of the graves cannot be understood without the noise of the nights that came before, and the brilliance of those nights cannot be remembered honestly without acknowledging the shadows that trailed them. The early glamour of heroin in Paris rested upon illusion, and every illusion carries within it a turning point when the mask falls away. For the artists of Montmartre and Montparnasse, that turning point often arrived quietly, without announcement. It did not come as a dramatic collapse on stage or a sudden public scandal. Instead, it crept into their lives like a draft through a cracked window, chilling the room little by little until warmth was gone. Jean Cocteau, who left behind one of the clearest records of addiction's grip, described heroin as both a comforter and a tyrant. At first, he believed it lent him clarity, a soft golden veil through which the harshness of life seemed more bearable. Nights of writing felt more fluid. The words came as if dictated by an unseen muse. He felt almost grateful to the drug, believing it had given him a key to doors that inspiration alone could not open. But soon he noticed that the muse demanded repayment. When he tried to write without it, his pen trembled, his sentences faltered, and despair filled the void. What he once thought was freedom revealed itself as captivity. The same story unfolded in different forms across Paris's artistic circles. A young violinist, celebrated for his intensity, began arriving late to performances. At first, audiences forgave him. After all, geniuses were allowed their eccentricities. His bow hand shook slightly, but his passion seemed undiminished. Then, gradually, his playing lost precision. Notes once sharp and brilliant grew blurred, as though wrapped in fog. Critics noticed, whispering of decline. Friends saw the cause, but were powerless to intervene. The violinist believed he needed heroin to return to his old brilliance, not realizing that it was the very substance unraveling his art. Painters, too, fell into the same embrace. One in particular, remembered by his peers though forgotten by history, filled his canvases with strange, luminous shapes during his first encounters with heroin. His exhibitions drew curious crowds. Critics wrote that his work glowed with otherworldly energy, as if he had tapped into visions beyond ordinary human sight. The painter believed it too, but soon his hands betrayed him. The brush strokes grew uncertain, his colors muddied, the visions blurred, leaving only frustration. His final canvases were left unfinished in a cold studio, where paint hardened on. Neglected writers, ever in pursuit of the perfect sentence, were not immune. Some turned to heroin believing it would sharpen their thoughts, smooth the rough edges of prose, or grant access to deeper truths. But heroin does not sustain the creative spirit, it consumes it. Hours that might have been spent writing were swallowed by the drug's demands. Pages remained blank. Journals filled instead with laments of exhaustion. The illusion of brilliance gave way to silence. Friends and colleagues often stood by helplessly, watching decline unfold in slow motion. In the cafes of Montparnasse, conversations once lively with wit and debate grew quiet as one or another fell absent. Too weary to appear, performances were missed, deadlines abandoned. Yet the city around them continued its carnival, and the noise of jazz and laughter drowned the subtle sound of lives unraveling. The tragedy was not only in the individual losses, but in how invisible they often seemed at the time. Heroin's turning point for the community came not when a single artist fell, but when the pattern became undeniable. By the mid-1920s, whispers circulated. A singer collapsed backstage before her performance. A poet, long admired, vanished from the cafes entirely. A sculptor was found unconscious in his studio, surrounded by tools he could no longer wield. None of these incidents alone defined the era, but together they painted a picture of decline. It was in this atmosphere that Cocteau's voice became especially poignant. His writings revealed what many feared to admit, that heroin did not enhance art, it devoured it. He described the mornings when the drug's absence left him shaking, when the simplest tasks became insurmountable, when even the sunlight through the curtains seemed unbearable. These words, written with painful honesty, gave shape to what countless others experienced in silence. They showed that heroin was not the gift it once seemed, but a thief stealing both time and talent. There is a peculiar cruelty in addiction, for it promises the very thing it destroys. The violinist sought perfect music. The painter sought transcendent visions. The writer sought words beyond ordinary reach. All believed heroin would lead them there, yet all found themselves silenced, their gifts diminished, their lives shortened. The turning point was always the same, the moment they realized they could not create without it. Dependency was the chain that bound them, and few managed to break free. Yet even as decline set in, the city above them glittered on. The Foley's Burger still filled with applause for Josephine Baker. Hemingway still wrote his early novels in the cafes. Jazz bands played until dawn. To the outsider, Paris was untouched by decay. The tourists who arrived from London or New York saw only the brilliance, not the cost. The tragedy was hidden beneath the surface, visible only to those who knew the artists personally or read the despair between their lines. History often remembers only the names that survived: Cocteau, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Baker. But behind them stood a generation less fortunate, their names absent from books and monuments. These were the actors whose final performances went unrecorded, the poets whose verses remain in private notebooks, the musicians whose songs were never written down. Their turning point came and went, and with it the possibility of their contribution to art and humanity. The cemeteries remind us of the outcome, but it is in Montmartre's smoky rooms and Montparnasse's cluttered studios that the turning point unfolded in real time. One can imagine the painter staring at his unfinished canvas, the violinist setting down his bow in frustration, the writer tearing another blank page from his notebook. The silence that followed these moments was the true beginning of the end. Addiction did not only wound individuals, it cast a shadow across friendships, across communities of artists who relied upon one another for inspiration and companionship. When one faltered, others suffered as well. Collaborations broke apart, plans dissolved. The carnival of creativity began to show cracks, and beneath its surface the city carried a hidden sorrow. It is here, in these turning points, that the story of Heroin in Paris becomes more than a tale of indulgence. It becomes a tragedy of wasted potential, of brilliance undone, of dreams interrupted. The artists believed they were reaching for something higher, and in a sense, they were. But what they grasped was not the muse, but the chain. The ruin of Heroin in Paris was not confined to the narrow circle of artists, while painters, poets, and musicians left behind journals or half-finished works to testify to their struggles. Countless others carried their addiction in silence. The social fabric of the city bore the strain, though the glamour of the decade often obscured its threads. To understand the depth of this shadow, one must leave the cabarets of Montmartre and walk into the apartments of the Latin Quarter, the dressing rooms of theaters, and the salons of the wealthy where indulgence was not art, but habit. In the Latin Quarter, where students lived in cramped boarding houses, heroin became a whispered experiment. The war had left many young men restless, skeptical of old certainties. Universities overflowed with foreign students, especially from America, who came seeking intellectual freedom and the intoxicating atmosphere of Paris. Nights in cheap cafes stretched long with debate about politics, philosophy, and art. In such spaces, heroin appeared as a novelty, offered by a friend of a friend, passed discreetly beneath tables already cluttered with empty glasses. A student might try it once, laughing at the strange serenity it brought. A second time came more easily, and soon the drug crept into the rhythm of their lives. Some failed their studies, too weary to attend lectures. Others disappeared from Paris altogether, sent home by worried families who spoke little of the cause. For many, no trace remains but a note in university records. Did not return. Actors and dancers, always under the merciless gaze of audiences, were especially vulnerable. The stage demanded perfection each night, and nerves frayed beneath the lights. Heroin seemed to offer a solution. A small dose before the curtain rose calmed the trembling, steadied the voice, softened the fear. But dependency grew, and the performance quality declined. Audiences noticed missed lines, faltering steps. A dancer who once leapt with effortless grace now stumbled, and whispers spread through the crowd. Managers replaced them quietly, erasing names from posters without explanation. Behind the velvet curtains, the dressing rooms told another story of powder scattered across vanities, of small vials hidden in costume trunks, of performers caught between the adoration of the crowd and the despair of their private lives. Even among the aristocracy and bourgeois circles, heroin found its place. In salons along the boulevard, housemen, conversations about art and politics were accompanied not only by champagne, but also by the discreet passing of a vial. For the wealthy, the drug was less about inspiration and more about ennui. After years of opulence, after countless nights of banquets and entertainments, heroin promised a new sensation, a new thrill. It was consumed as casually as one might sip cognac, yet the consequences were the same. Families whispered of sudden illnesses, of heirs who withdrew from society, of daughters who became frail and nervous. But discretion was paramount. Newspapers did not report the troubles of the wealthy, and scandals were buried beneath the weight of privilege. The police, for their part, did little. Overwhelmed by the nightlife economy, they focused on maintaining order in the streets, preventing brawls outside clubs, or breaking up drunken disturbances. Heroin, traded quietly in back rooms or purchased through prescriptions, attracted little attention. In some ways, it seemed invisible compared to the noisy presence of alcohol. The city authorities preferred to ignore what they did not fully understand. By the time arrests began to appear in the late 1920s, the substance had already woven itself into the fabric of urban life. Paris itself bore witness in subtle ways. Hospital records noted rising cases of unexplained collapses, of sudden fevers, of nervous exhaustion. The doctors rarely named heroin as the cause, for to do so would mean admitting how widespread it had become. The newspapers reported occasional scandals: a singer arrested for possession, a young man found unconscious in a public garden. Yet these stories were always framed as exceptions, not as signs of a larger trend. The city preferred its myth of brilliance, its reputation as the capital of freedom. To tarnish that myth with an epidemic of addiction was unthinkable. And yet the signs were everywhere. In the morning markets, women whispered of neighbors who had grown pale and withdrawn. Landlords in the Latin Quarter complained of tenants who failed to pay rent, their rooms littered with broken bottles and scattered papers. Theater directors lamented the unreliability of certain actors, though they spoke cautiously to avoid scandal. Among musicians, rumors spread of colleagues who could no longer play without first indulging. Their instruments left silent when the supply ran dry. The social aftershocks of heroin were not explosive, but corrosive. They did not erupt in riots or revolutions, but ate slowly at the edges of society. They eroded trust within families, dimmed the brilliance of the stage, and silenced voices in the cafes. They added a subtle note of sorrow to the city's laughter, a reminder that behind every dazzling performance might lie a private despair. It is easy, from a distance of a century, to view the heroin of 1920s Paris as a problem confined to artists, as though creativity itself carried the seed of destruction. But this was never the case. The drug reached into every layer of society, from the poorest students to the wealthiest salons. Its appeal was not limited to those seeking inspiration. It was equally strong for those seeking escape from fear, from boredom, from the ordinary weight of existence. In this sense, heroin was a mirror of the decade itself, a substance that promised liberation but concealed captivity, that glittered on the surface but carried darkness within. What Paris experienced in those years was not merely a fashion or a fad, but a quiet epidemic. It spread through whispers, through hidden exchanges, through the casual indifference of authorities. It left behind no grand monuments, only silences, absences, and the faint scars visible to those who look closely. Its victims were not only individuals, but also the communities they inhabited, the performances they never gave, the friendships that dissolved, the dreams abandoned. The broader circle of Paris students, actors, aristocrats, the working poor reminds us that heroin was never simply an artist's tragedy. It was a social one, reaching across boundaries of class and profession. It showed that in a city devoted to brilliance, even the brightest lights could cast shadows, and those shadows fell upon everyone, not only the famous. This is the larger stage upon which our story unfolds. The cemeteries remind us of the outcome. Montmartre shows us the promise. The artists reveal the turning point. But here, in the lives of ordinary Parisians touched by heroin, we see the aftershocks that spread quietly across an entire society. It is a reminder that every glittering age carries with it not only its triumphs, but also its hidden sorrows, whispered in back rooms, concealed behind velvet curtains, buried in the unmarked graves of history. The Paris of today does not carry the same rhythms as the 1920s. Yet if one listens closely, the echoes are there on certain nights. When the streets of Montmartre grow quiet and only a few cafes remain open, the city seems to hum faintly with the memory of jazz, as though the saxophones of Sidney Beckett or the laughter of Josephine Baker still drift through the air. Yet behind that music lingers another echo, less audible but no less real, the whisper of a century-old struggle with heroin, and the reminder that even in an age of brilliance, shadows move silently through the city's veins. The lesson of that decade lies not only in the loss of individual lives, but in the fragility of human ambition. The cemeteries tell us what became of those who surrendered to the drug. Montmartre's stories reveal the illusions that drew them in. The journals of Jean Cocteau show the torment of one who survived, while the silence of forgotten names reminds us of those who did not. The broader social fabric, the students, the actors, the aristocrats shows that heroin was never merely an artist's vice, but a quiet social epidemic. What remains is not only a history of addiction, but a parable about the nature of desire and the dangers of excess. To reflect upon 1920s Paris is to confront the paradox of human creation. Out of the same streets came some of the greatest art and literature of the 20th century, yet those same streets hid the decay of lives undone. The glitter and the ruin walked together, inseparable. The brilliance of jazz was made sharper by the darkness that followed it. The laughter of the cabarets was framed by the silence of hospital wards and forgotten rooms. The truth is never one-sided. It is not possible to honor the brilliance of the era without also acknowledging the cost. When we consider heroin's role in that decade, we must also think of the present. 100 years have passed, and yet addiction remains a familiar shadow. In modern cities, today the names of the substances have changed: opioids, fentanyl, synthetic drugs, but the pattern is strikingly similar. What begins as a promise of relief or inspiration becomes a chain of dependency. Families are left grieving, communities are strained, and silence follows brilliance once again. The past does not simply repeat itself, but it does rhyme, and Paris of the 1920s offers us a verse that resonates today. The parallel is not only in substances, but in society's response. Then, as now, there was a desire to ignore the shadow, to focus on the glitter. In the 1920s, tourists marveled at Paris without seeing its hidden epidemic. In the present, We scroll through images of prosperity while overlooking the quiet crises around us. The temptation is always the same: to celebrate the music without hearing the silence, to admire the glitter without noticing the ruin. But history reminds us that both are always present, woven together in the human story. There is also a personal reflection that cannot be avoided. Each of us, in our own way, carries illusions that promise brilliance but conceal danger. They may not take the form of heroin, but they lure us all the same ambitions that erode our peace. Indulgences that consume more than they give, desires that whisper of freedom while leading to captivity. The story of Paris in the 1920s is not distant history. It is a mirror held before us. It asks what illusions we are willing to entertain, and what costs we may ignore until it is too late. And yet, amidst the sorrow, there remains something enduring. Paris still shines. Its streets are still alive with music. Its cafes filled with voices. Its theaters with light. The city has survived its shadows, and in surviving, it carries the memory of those who did not. To walk the streets today is to walk in their footsteps, to feel both the weight of their losses and the inspiration of their dreams. The silence of the cemeteries coexists with the laughter of the boulevards, reminding us that life is never free of shadow, but also never without light. This is why we begin our journey here, in reflection. The quiet ruin behind the glitter of 1920s Paris is not only a story of the past, but a caution for the present. It tells us that brilliance and destruction often walk hand in hand, that every age has its shadows, and that our task is not to ignore them, but to see them clearly. Only then can we honor the lives lost, the art left unfinished, and the lessons history offers. So tonight, as we close this first chapter, imagine the city at midnight. The lights of Montmartre flicker, the Seine flows dark and steady, and the cemeteries rest in silence. Beneath it all lies a story both beautiful and tragic, glittering and shadowed. A story that belongs not only to Paris, but to all of us who search for meaning in a world that offers both brilliance and ruin. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments to understand why the artists, musicians, and wanderers of the 1920s surrendered so willingly to the intoxication of Paris. One must first walk with them through Montmartre after the sun has set. By day the hill was ordinary enough: vendors selling bread and fruit in the marketplace, children chasing one another past the small shops, the faint smell of coal smoke drifting up from narrow chimneys. But as evening approached, Montmartre transformed. The lamps along the boulevards glowed with a golden haze. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, and from behind closed doors came the muffled sound of pianos warming up for the night's performance. Paris had always been called the City of Lights, but in Montmartre, light was not only a matter of electricity or flame. It was a mood, a spell cast upon the weary. After the Great War, Europe longed for forgetfulness, and Paris supplied it. The cafes filled quickly, students and artists crowding wooden tables, their notebooks open, their voices loud with argument. Smoke curled from every corner, mingling with the rich aroma of black coffee and the sharp tang of cheap tobacco. Glasses clinked, laughter rose, and the hours slipped away as if the clocks themselves had fallen under enchantment. Everywhere there was music. From small basements came the pulse of drums, the wail of saxophones, the restless improvisations of American jazz. Soldiers returning from the war had carried the rhythms with them, and Paris embraced them with a hunger that was almost desperate. Jazz was not only sound, it was a declaration that life could move forward, that joy could still exist in a continent scarred by trenches and loss. In the dance halls, couples twirled with abandon, their shadows leaping across walls stained with decades of smoke. The floorboards trembled beneath their feet, and the air was hot with the mingled sense of sweat, perfume, and spilled wine. Among these crowds, names that would later become legendary mingled freely with strangers. Ernest Hemingway, not yet the figure carved into literary history, sat with his notebook and a drink, listening more than he spoke, his sharp eyes capturing every gesture. F. Scott Fitzgerald, restless and impulsive, laughed too loudly at jokes, and raised his glass too often, hiding his unease beneath a mask of charm. Painters, their clothes stained with oils, sketched quickly on scraps of paper, capturing a dancer's form or the angle of a musician's face. Poets recited half-finished lines over the noise, while critics and philosophers argued about politics. In corners, their voices drowned by the music, but their gestures passionate all the same. The magnetism of Montmartre lay not in order, but in chaos. It was a place where rules dissolved. Wealthy tourists from London or New York sat beside penniless students, aristocrats, their jewels glittering in the lamplight, shared tables with revolutionaries plotting against the state. Language itself seemed unnecessary. The rhythm of the night was universal. For many, this freedom was irresistible. After years of war and rationing, Montmartre offered abundance of sound, of taste, of sensation. The very air seemed thick with promise. Josephine Baker embodied that promise more than anyone else. When she stepped onto the stage of the Follies Burger in 1925, the audience erupted. Her movements were bold, playful, filled with a kind of joy that no one else could summon. She danced not as a performer alone, but as a symbol of liberation, of a new era unshackled from the gloom of the past. The feathers, the pearls, the dazzling costumes mattered less than the energy she radiated. She was at once exotic and familiar, otherworldly yet profoundly human. To see her dance was to believe, if only for a moment, that life could be reborn. The lights, the music, the glamour, all of these formed the surface of Montmartre's allure. But beneath the surface was something deeper. The people who gathered here were not merely seeking entertainment. They were searching for meaning. They wanted to feel alive again, to drown the memory of trenches and funerals, to convince themselves that the future could be brighter than the past. The cafes became temples of conversation, the dance halls sanctuaries of forgetting. Paris promised them both brilliance and escape, and Montmartre was its beating heart. Yet even in these brilliant nights, shadows lingered at the edges. A writer staring too long into his glass, a dancer vanishing from the stage mid-performance, a student whispering about a new powder that promised calm. The laughter and applause drowned these moments. but they were there. Faint reminders that every glittering light casts a shadow. The spell of Montmartre cannot be captured in a single image. It was the combination of sights, sounds, and sensations that created its power. The smoke that stung the eyes, the heat of crowded rooms, the bitter taste of wine on the tongue, the pounding rhythm of jazz in the chest, the dazzling sight of dancers in motion together. They formed a world in which ordinary time ceased to exist. For those who entered, the night was endless, the possibilities infinite. To leave was to feel a sudden emptiness, as if stepping out of a dream. And so, they returned, night after night, surrendering themselves to the city's embrace. Montmartre's allure was, in truth, irresistible. It was not only a place, but an idea that life could be lived without restraint, that brilliance could be found in excess, that art and pleasure could merge into one for many. This idea became their guiding star. But as we will see, the star they followed carried them not only to moments of joy, but also to the shadows we have already glimpsed in the cemeteries. For Montmartre's brilliance, like all brilliance, came at a cost. The sound of jazz was not simply music in Paris of the 1920s. It was a fever that spread through the veins of the city. It began in small basements and smoke-filled back rooms, carried across the Atlantic by African-American musicians who found in Paris an audience more welcoming than the one at home. Here, their rhythms were not dismissed but celebrated, their talent not restricted but exalted. Paris embraced jazz as though it were a cure for the sorrow that had settled over Europe. After the war, the music itself was unlike anything Parisians had heard before. The steady, predictable rhythms of traditional European compositions seemed lifeless in comparison to the restless improvisations of jazz. A trumpet might leap into the air like a sudden shout. A clarinet might bend a note into something strange and haunting. A saxophone might wail with longing and desire. No two nights were the same. Musicians improvised, chasing inspiration wherever it led, and the crowd followed eagerly. To sit in those clubs was to feel that life itself had become unpredictable, that anything could happen in the next bar, the next phrase. Champagne flowed as freely as the music. The pop of corks punctuated the rhythms of the drums, and glasses clinked in counterpoint to the melodies. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of bottles, their black jackets stained with droplets of spilled wine. Foam sparkled in the candlelight, the bubbles rising like tiny stars captured in liquid. To drink was not merely to quench thirst. It was to participate in the spirit of the night, to declare oneself alive. Men and women alike raised their glasses high, laughing, shouting, sometimes crying, as though the champagne itself carried the power to wash away sorrow. The fever of jazz and champagne was most intense in Montmartre's famous clubs: La Bouffe, Sur la Toit, Bricktops, the Bal Inca. These names whispered promises of adventure to every newcomer. Inside, the rooms were thick with smoke, the air hot with sweat, the floorboards trembling beneath the stamping of dancers. A visitor might enter uncertain and leave transformed, as though the music had burned away layers of caution and hesitation. Couples pressed close, spinning across the floor, their shadows leaping wildly on the walls. Strangers clasped hands, as if they had known one another for years. In that fever, the boundaries of class, nationality, and race seemed to dissolve. It is said that Sidney Beckett's clarinet could bring a room to silence or to frenzy within a single song. He played not only with skill but with force, pouring every emotion into the music until it seemed the instrument itself would split apart. The crowd listened, swayed, shouted, demanded more. Around him, other musicians joined in, each pushing the music higher, faster, wilder. The fever spread like fire, consuming all hesitation. When the final note faded, the silence was filled at once with thunderous applause, glasses raised, and the cry for another song. Writers, too, fell under the fever. Hemingway wrote of nights spent listening to music until dawn, describing the raw energy that seemed to tear away the pretenses of society. Fitzgerald, who understood both the glamour and the despair of excess, found inspiration in the champagne-soaked laughter of those nights. Painters sketched quickly by candlelight, trying to capture the bend of a saxophonist's body, the blur of a dancer's skirt. Even philosophers found themselves caught in the rhythm, arguing theories between sets as though jazz itself had reshaped the world. But with fever always comes risk. Nights of music and champagne stretched into mornings of exhaustion. Performers stumbled home as dawn lightened the sky, their shoes worn, their voices hoarse, their pockets empty. Some sought relief in heroin, believing it could steady trembling hands or soften the weight of fatigue. Others drank more heavily or vanished for days, reappearing only when debts were paid or friends dragged them back to the cafes. The fever that gave life also consumed it, leaving some stronger and others undone. Yet the city itself seemed unconcerned. Paris thrived on the fever, drawing tourists from across the world who longed to experience its heat. They arrived by train from London, by ship from New York, eager to taste the champagne, to hear the music, to lose themselves in the chaos. Guidebooks promised adventure, and the clubs delivered. Each visitor returned home with stories of nights that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Paris became legend, its reputation built upon the fever that few other cities could match. For those who lived there, however, the fever was both blessing and curse. Musicians played with brilliance, but wore their bodies thin. Dancers filled theaters with joy but collapsed in private with exhaustion. Writers filled pages with passion but emptied themselves in the process. The champagne that sparkled in the glass left headaches in its wake, and the music that inspired freedom often drowned out the cries of those who fell beneath its rhythm. The fever of jazz and champagne was, in truth, a mask. It covered the unease of a generation that had survived war, but not forgotten it. Beneath the laughter, memories of trenches lingered. Beneath the dancing, grief for lost brothers and fathers remained. The fever did not erase these memories. It only concealed them, offering a temporary illusion of joy. But illusions, as we know, cannot endure forever. Still, it would be wrong to dismiss those nights as empty or false. For many, they were moments of genuine liberation. The music broke barriers that had seemed immovable. The champagne united strangers in fleeting but unforgettable kinship. The fever allowed people to feel alive in ways they had feared were lost forever. It was both fragile and real, dangerous and necessary to stand in one of those clubs, to feel the floor trembling beneath the dancers, to hear the trumpet cutting through smoke and laughter. This was to be part of something larger than oneself. It was to join in a chorus of humanity crying out against despair, declaring through music and motion that life could still be beautiful. And though the fever carried shadows, it also carried light. The fever of jazz and champagne defined Montmartre, defined Paris, defined an entire generation. It was the heartbeat of the city, quickened by improvisation, sustained by laughter, softened by the glow of champagne glasses. To remember it is to remember both the brilliance and the cost, the joy that lifted spirits and the shadows that followed close behind. Among the countless figures who gave life to Montmartre in the 1920s, none embodied its spirit more vividly than the dancers. They were the dreamers of the body, shaping movement into poetry, transforming rhythm into living art. If jazz was the heartbeat of the age, then dancers were its visible pulse, carrying the fever through every leap, every spin, every shiver of a sequined dress beneath the stage lights. To enter the Foley's Burger on a crowded night was to step into a realm of spectacle, unlike anything else in Europe. The velvet curtains shimmered with gold trim, chandeliers cast warm light across the audience, and the air hummed with anticipation when the orchestra struck its opening chords. Conversation ceased, cigarettes burned unattended, and hundreds of eyes turned toward the stage. Then Josephine Baker appeared, and the theater erupted. Her arrival in Paris in 1925 was more than a performance. It was an event that shifted the city's imagination. With her playful smile and daring movements, she seemed to embody the liberation of a new era. Her dances were filled with humor, joy, and provocation. In her famous banana skirt, she turned the absurd into the sublime, mocking stereotypes even as she captivated her audience. Each gesture carried a message. Life was to be lived boldly, without apology, without restraint. She was not merely a dancer, she was a revolution of the body. Around her, other dancers and performers thrived. Cabarets across Montmartre filled their stages with chorus lines, comedians, and acrobats. The dancers were not always famous, but they carried the same energy, the same hunger to dazzle. They rehearsed in dim studios where mirrors reflected both ambition and exhaustion, where the scent of dust and sweat clung to the air. Hours of practice preceded a few minutes of brilliance beneath the lights. Yet those minutes mattered more than anything else. For many, the stage was not only work but survival, a way to escape poverty, to find recognition, to belong to the fever that consumed Paris. The dreamers extended beyond the dancers themselves. Painters filled sketchbooks with rapid drawings of performers mid-motion. Writers compared their movements to poetry, searching for metaphors that might capture what words alone could not. Even audiences became dreamers, swept into the illusion that for a few hours they had entered a world of endless possibility. A factory worker sitting in the balcony might forget his toil. An aristocrat in the front row might believe, for a moment, that life was more than etiquette and duty. The stage offered not only entertainment, but transformation. But every dream carries its cost. Behind the glamour of sequins and feathers lay grueling routines, aching bodies, and relentless pressure to perform. Dancers faced the constant threat of replacement. One stumble, one missed rehearsal, and another eager body would take their place. Managers were merciless, audiences fickle. The applause that lifted spirits one night might vanish the next, leaving the performer alone with exhaustion. In this world, Heroin whispered its deceptive promise. Just a small dose to steady the nerves, to ease the pain in muscles, to grant the illusion of energy for one more performance. Many listened, believing they could control it. Few did. Josephine Baker herself avoided that fate, though she was surrounded by it. She was sustained not only by her extraordinary talent, but also by her resilience and discipline. Yet even she could not escape the pressures of fame, the scrutiny of critics, the endless demand for novelty. Her triumph was exceptional precisely because so many others faltered around her. Fellow performers slipped quietly into decline, their names erased from posters, their costumes left hanging in dusty closets. The dreamers who once commanded stages disappeared into silence, remembered only in fragments of reviews or faded photographs. The fascination with dancers was not only about movement, but about freedom. After the horrors of the war, audiences longed to see bodies that expressed joy rather than suffering, playfulness rather than discipline. Every leap, every smile, every outstretched arm seemed to proclaim that life had returned. That pleasure was possible again. The dancers became symbols of resilience, embodying what society desperately wanted to believe. Yet symbols cannot always bear the weight placed upon them. The expectation to be endlessly radiant, endlessly new, was itself a burden that consumed many lives. Still, the dream persisted. In cafes after performances, dancers and admirers mingled. Conversations were filled with laughter, cigarettes glowing in the dim light, glasses of wine raised in endless toasts. Promises of future success were made casually, as if the night itself guaranteed them. Friendships were forged, romances began, collaborations were imagined. In these circles, the line between reality and dream blurred. Everyone believed they were part of something eternal, something that would never fade. But time, as always, told another story. Some dancers vanished into obscurity, their names surviving only in theater bills preserved by collectors. Some succumbed to addiction, their bodies no longer able to endure the strain. A few rose to international fame, carrying the spirit of Montmartre far beyond Paris. Together, they formed the living mosaic of the 1920s, dazzling, fragile, unforgettable. The dancers and dreamers of Montmartre reveal to us the heart of Paris's allure. They show us why people flocked to the city, why they surrendered themselves to its fever. They remind us that art is not created only in books and paintings, but also in movement, in laughter, in the fleeting brilliance of a performance that vanishes the moment the curtain falls. Their lives, filled with both triumph and tragedy, capture the paradox of the decade, brilliance born out of fragility, dreams pursued in the face of inevitable decline. To recall them now is to honor not only the legends like Josephine Baker, but also the countless unnamed who danced, dreamed, and disappeared. They remind us that behind every famous name lies a chorus of forgotten voices, each contributing to the rhythm of the age. Without them, Paris would not have glittered so brightly, nor would its shadows have been so deep. The glitter of Montmartre dazzled, but in its shadows, quieter transactions unfolded. Behind the brilliance of the stage, in the corners of cafes where the light grew dim, heroin passed from hand to hand. It was never part of the official spectacle. It did not belong to the posters, the music, or the laughter. It belonged to the pauses between, to the silences that came when the curtain fell, when the audience had left, and when the performers were alone with exhaustion. The origins of these transactions were unremarkable, almost ordinary. In pharmacies along the Boulevard Saint-Germain or Rue de Rivoli, heroin could be purchased under the guise of medicine. Pharmacists sold it discreetly, wrapping vials in brown paper, slipping them across counters with barely a word. For the respectable, this was the preferred path. No dealers, no secrecy, just a quiet exchange of francs for relief. Doctors, too, prescribed it without the alarm we attach to it today. A patient complaining of nerves, sleeplessness, or pain might walk away with a bottle that promised calm. The boundary between medicine and indulgence blurred, and Paris's citizens stepped easily across it. But in Montmartre's clubs, the exchanges took another form. Musicians whispered to one another about where to find a supply. Actors knew the dressing room, corners where a colleague might share a vial. Students traded small packets in boarding houses, their laughter masking the seriousness of the act. These were not transactions of desperation, but of curiosity, indulgence, even camaraderie. To share heroin was, in some circles, to share intimacy, to join in a bond that seemed deeper than conversation. The drug became another form of currency in a nightlife already rich with excess. For the performers, heroin often began as a tool. A dancer, sore from endless rehearsals, found in it a balm that eased pain long enough to step back onto the stage. A singer, nerves frayed before a performance, discovered that a small dose steadied the hands and loosened the voice. A musician, exhausted from playing until dawn, believed it granted one more night of brilliance. In those first encounters, heroin seemed less like poison and more like salvation. Yet dependency crept in with silence. What began as an occasional indulgence became a necessity. The dancer could not leap without it. The singer could not face the crowd. The musician could not lift his instrument. The drug's gift became a demand. And so, in the same dressing rooms where laughter rang, where champagne glasses clinked, there were also moments of solitude when performers stared into mirrors, their painted faces unable to hide the truth. Behind them, the costumes glittered, but before them, the reflection showed fatigue deeper than makeup could conceal. For the wealthy, heroin took on another role. In salons where aristocrats gathered, its presence was a symbol of sophistication, a secret indulgence shared among the privileged. It was passed not with shame, but with elegance, as though it were no more dangerous than fine wine. Conversations, about politics or art were punctuated by its quiet use. And the very act of sharing it created a sense of exclusivity. In such circles, dependency was hidden beneath layers of discretion, masked by wealth and social influence. The consequences, however, were the same. Heirs grew pale and nervous. Daughters fainted in ballrooms. Families whispered explanations that concealed more than they revealed. The police, though not ignorant, were hesitant to intervene. Their focus remained on maintaining order in the visible chaos of Paris's nightlife. They dealt with drunken brawls, rowdy tourists, and petty theft. Heroin, exchanged quietly in respectable pharmacies or discreet salons, did not produce public disorder, and so it spread, shielded by silence. By the time arrests and seizures became more common, in the late 1920s, the habit had already entrenched itself in many layers of Parisian society. The tragedy of these hidden transactions lay not only in the individuals who fell into dependency, but also in the erosion of trust within communities. Musicians who once relied upon one another to sustain a rhythm found colleagues unreliable, absent, or trembling with withdrawal. Actors missed rehearsals, forcing entire productions to falter. Students abandoned their studies, leaving professors puzzled at their sudden decline. Behind every missing performer or vanished scholar was a quiet exchange. A vial passed from one hand to another in the shadows of Montmartre. Ordinary Parisians noticed. Though they rarely spoke openly, market women whispered of neighbors who grew pale and thin. Landlords found rooms littered with empty bottles, unpaid rent accumulating. Families struggled to explain the sudden illnesses of loved ones. Some suspected, others knew, but few confronted the reality directly. To name heroin was to pierce the illusion of glamour, to admit that the city of lights had shadows that even brilliance could not banish. It is important to understand that these addictions were rarely dramatic. They did not announce themselves with sudden collapse, though that sometimes came. They unfolded slowly, almost invisibly. A performer missed one show, then another. A student failed one exam, then disappeared. A wealthy heir withdrew from society, his absence explained by vague talk of illness. The city carried on as though nothing had changed, the music and laughter drowning out the quiet ruin. Only later, when cemeteries grew heavier with the names of the young, did the truth become undeniable. Yet even in these quiet tragedies, there was a peculiar tenderness. Friends tried to intervene, slipping notes of encouragement under doors, dragging colleagues back onto stages, lending money that would never be repaid. Some succeeded in saving one another, though often only for a time. Others watched helplessly as those they loved slipped further into dependency. The hidden transactions were not only exchanges of vials, but also exchanges of loyalty, of despair, of hope. They tied people together in bonds both fragile and profound. The story of Paris's hidden addictions reminds us that ruin is rarely public at first. It begins in whispers, in discreet packages, in choices made quietly in the shadows. Of brilliance, the glamour of Montmartre was real, the fever of jazz and champagne undeniable. But beneath the music, beneath the laughter, the quiet rhythm of dependency beat steadily. invisible to those who did not wish to see Dot, and so the city of lights glowed on, its brilliance covering the shadows that grew beneath it. Visitors carried home memories of glitter and spectacle, unaware of the quiet transactions they had never noticed, the lives unraveling just out of sight. Only in hindsight can we see both sides together, the glamour and the ruin inseparable, woven into the fabric of the same night. There was a feeling in Montmartre during the 1920s that the nights would never end. The music seemed inexhaustible, the champagne endless, the dancers tireless. Each evening bled into the next, until time itself appeared suspended in the glow of lamps and the wail of saxophones. For those who lived within the fever, it felt as though they had discovered eternity, not the eternity of solemn churches or ancient tombs, but the eternity of pleasure, of movement, of light. This illusion was powerful because it spoke to a generation scarred by war. The young men who returned from the trenches had seen death at close range, and many refused to live cautiously afterward. The women, too, who had carried the burdens of wartime labor, sought freedom in their own ways, through fashion, through dance, through daring conversations in cafes. The nights of Montmartre became a collective vow. We will not return to silence. We will not submit to despair. The future may be uncertain, but tonight, here, in this moment, life will be celebrated. The illusion of endless nights was sustained by ritual. Every evening began with the lighting of lamps, the opening of cabaret doors, the first strains of a band warming up. Crowds gathered quickly, their footsteps echoing on cobblestones, their laughter carrying through narrow streets. Inside the clubs, candles flickered, waiters hurried, corks popped, and the fever of music began. For hours, the world outside disappeared. Politics, poverty, pre-fall seemed irrelevant once the rhythm took hold. Writers captured fragments of these nights, though even their words seemed inadequate. Hemingway wrote of the rawness, the immediacy, the sense that life was being lived on the edge. Fitzgerald, with his gift for both glamour and melancholy, described the intoxication of excess, knowing even as he celebrated it that decline lurked. Nearby, painters filled canvases with blurred lines and bold colors. Trying to capture motion itself, photographers froze moments of dancers mid-leap, musicians mid-note, glasses raised in mid-toast. But the true essence of those nights could never be fully preserved. It lived only in the experience, in the illusion of endlessness. Yet illusions are fragile. Morning always arrived. The lamps dimmed, the music faded, the champagne lost its sparkle. Performers collapsed into sleep, their bodies aching. Waiters swept broken glass from floors. Musicians packed instruments into worn cases, and the clubs fell silent. The streets, littered with cigarette ends and scraps of paper, bore witness to the revelry but not to the meaning it carried. When dawn spread across Paris, the illusion dissolved, leaving behind the ordinariness of daylight. For many, this daily disillusionment bred a deeper hunger. If the night could not last, perhaps it could be prolonged with help. Some turned to more drink, others to heroin, seeking to stretch the boundaries of pleasure, to hold on to the illusion just a little longer. Each attempt, however, only revealed the futility of the chase. The endless night could not be captured. It was always slipping away, always dissolving with the sunrise. The tragedy of the era lies in how fiercely people believed in the illusion. They thought they could outpace time with music, conquer sorrow with champagne, silence despair with heroin, and for a moment, perhaps, they succeeded. The nights were brilliant, unforgettable, filled with laughter and beauty. But time remained undefeated. The musicians aged, the dancers faltered, the clubs closed, and the cemeteries grew heavier. The illusion of endless nights gave way to the reality of fleeting lives. Yet even as we reflect on the cost, we cannot dismiss the brilliance. Those nights, though temporary, were real. The music was genuine, the laughter heartfelt, the dances unforgettable. Illusions do not erase truth. They coexist with it. The endless nights may never have existed in reality, but they existed in the hearts of those who lived them, and they remain in memory even now. In the end, the illusion of Montmartre was not about defeating time, but about defying it. However briefly, it was about declaring, in the face of war and sorrow, that life could still be joyous, that beauty could still be found, that the human spirit could still rise. That is why we remember it not only for the ruin it concealed, but for the radiance it revealed. And so we close this chapter, standing at the threshold of Montmartre's glittering nights. The music echoes faintly still. The champagne sparkles in memory. The dancers whirl in the imagination. What we know now that behind every illusion lies a shadow, and that even the brightest night must yield to dawn. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. Among the countless souls drawn to Paris in the 1920s, the artists carried within them a peculiar hunger. They came not only to survive, but to create, to wrestle beauty out of chaos, to transform sorrow into music, words, and images. For them, Paris was not simply a city, but a crucible, a place where the weight of the past could be melted and recast into new forms. Yet it was also in Paris that Heroin found one of its most eager audiences, for it whispered directly to the artist's hunger, promising inspiration, clarity, and release. The promise was seductive precisely because it spoke the language of creation. Writers, staring at the blank page under the dim light of a cafe lamp, longed for words to flow without hesitation. Painters, exhausted after hours of struggling with form and color, craved the vision that would bring the canvas alive. Musicians, their hands sore from endless nights of performance, sought a way to keep playing as if fatigue did not exist. To each of these, Heroin presented itself not as poison, but as muse. A few drops, a small injection, and suddenly the mind seemed to open, thoughts quickened, colors deepened, music resonated more powerfully. At least, that was the illusion. Jean Cocteau's journals are among the clearest testimonies to this seduction. He spoke of heroin as though it were a companion sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel, but always present. At first, it seemed to lend him wings. His imagination soared, and words spilled onto the page with a fluency he had long desired. He felt, perhaps, that he had finally discovered the secret doorway into the world of pure creation. But the doorway was a trap, and every step through it bound him more tightly to the substance that seemed to free him. His reflections are filled with contradictions: gratitude for the visions Heroin gave, despair at the chains it fastened around him. Other artists followed similar paths, though their stories remain half-hidden. A young painter in Montparnasse found that Heroin gave his colors a luminous quality. He worked furiously, canvases piling up, critics praising his daring. But soon his hand began to tremble, and the visions grew muddled. His final works, abandoned in a studio that smelled of turpentine and smoke, showed not brilliance, but collapse. A violinist, once celebrated for the fire of his performances, used heroin to still his nerves before concerts. At first, it worked his bow steady, his sound unwavering. But as the months passed, he could no longer play without it. When the supply faltered, so did the music. His final concert ended in silence as he left the stage unable to continue. For many, the seduction was not only about creation, but also about belonging. Paris's artistic circles were filled with talk of experiments. With daring attempts to break tradition, writers debated the future of the novel. Painters shattered old forms with cubism and surrealism. Musicians fused rhythms from across continents. To indulge in heroin was, for some, another way of declaring rebellion, of aligning oneself with the avant-garde. It was not only a substance, but a symbol, a marker of courage to explore where others feared. In smoke-filled rooms, the sharing of heroin could feel like a ritual, a bond among those who believed they were at the edge of a new world. Yet beneath the surface of brilliance lay the shadow of dependency. The promise of inspiration turned quickly into a demand for survival. The painter no longer reached for heroin to see colors more vividly, but to steady his trembling hand enough to hold a brush. The writer no longer sought the drug for flowing words, but for the ability to endure. The silence when words refused to come. The musician no longer embraced it for brilliance, but for the bare possibility of playing a note. What began as a muse became a master, and the artist, once free, became enslaved. It is striking to consider how the very qualities that made artists susceptible to heroin, their sensitivity, their hunger for meaning, their openness to experience, were also the qualities that fueled their art. Their vulnerability was inseparable from their gift. And so heroin did not strike randomly. It targeted precisely those who sought the highest forms of expression. The drug's false promise was perfectly tailored. It seemed to offer what artists most desired, while in truth it stole from them the very capacity to create. The cafes of Montparnasse bore witness to this paradox. A poet sat at his table, a notebook open before him, his hand trembling slightly as he raised a cigarette. His friends laughed, argued, read their verses aloud, but his eyes were distant, his thoughts clouded. Later, he would scribble a few lines beautiful, haunting, but then fall silent for hours. A painter leaned against the wall, his canvas unfinished at home, his mind caught between visions and exhaustion. A musician tapped nervously at the table, hearing rhythms in his head, but unable to bring them to life without the drug around. Then, the noise of Paris continued, the clatter of glasses, the sound of jazz drifting in from the street, the endless chatter of dreamers. But inside their minds, Heroin whispered, louder than the world outside. The seduction of the artists reveals a truth larger than Paris itself. It shows us how easily human beings can be deceived by illusions that mimic their deepest desires. The hunger for inspiration is noble, yet when met with false gifts, it can lead to ruin. The artists of Paris believed they had found a companion for their creativity, but in reality they had welcomed an enemy disguised as a friend. Their story is not only about addiction, it is about the eternal tension between desire and discipline, between the longing for brilliance and the patience required to achieve it. As we reflect on their seduction, we must also recognize the cost to history. How many works were left unwritten? How many canvases abandoned? How many songs silenced? The brilliance we celebrate today, the novels of Hemingway, the paintings of Picasso, the dances of Baker stands alongside the silence of countless others who fell to Heroin's embrace. Their absence is as much a part of the history of Paris as the presence of those who survived. And so, in the story of 1920s Paris, the artists stand as both heroes and victims. They remind us of the power of creation, but also of the fragility of the human spirit when confronted with illusions too seductive to resist. Their promise of inspiration turned to ruin, and in that transformation we glimpse the shadow that haunted even the brightest lights of the City of Lights. The seduction of Heroin revealed itself most clearly in the intimate struggles of painters and poets. For the painter, whose eyes were trained to see color as vibration and form as living presence, Heroin seemed to offer a divine palette for the poet, whose ear was tuned to rhythm and silence. The drug whispered promises of flowing, words unbroken by hesitation. Yet what began as a gift of vision and fluency quickly dissolved into distortion and silence. In Montparnasse, one painter known in his time, but nearly forgotten, now spoke of Heroin as though it were a pigment the gods had hidden from mankind. He claimed that under its influence the canvas breathed, colors deepened, shadows glowed with inner fire. Visitors to his studio in the Rue de la Gaîté recalled walls covered in canvases alive with strange luminosity, forms half abstract and half familiar, like dreams caught before waking. Critics praised his boldness. Collectors purchased his work eagerly, believing they had discovered a new genius of modern art. In those years, his studio was filled with the smell of turpentine, tobacco, and the faint sweet scent of the drug itself. He painted furiously, his brush racing against time, as though he feared the visions would vanish if he slowed. But Heroin is patient in its cruelty. Slowly his hand began to betray him. The brush that once moved with confidence now trembled, smearing lines, dulling edges. The colors he once perceived as radiant began to blur. Collapsing into mud, his canvases grew darker, unfinished, stacked against the wall with faces turned inward. Friends noticed his absence from cafes, his silence during conversations, his unkempt clothes. When asked, he insisted he was still painting visions unseen by others. Yet the truth was plain. The visions had abandoned him, leaving only dependency in their place. His last canvases remain today in forgotten collections, strange relics of brilliance cut short. whispers of what might have been had he not trusted a false muse. The poets, too, were drawn into the illusion. To them, heroin offered not color, but rhythm, not form, but flow. Words seemed to arrive more easily. Images unfolded without effort. In dim cafes on the left bank, young poets scribbled furiously into notebooks. Convinced that their lines carried the weight of eternity, they read aloud to one another, voices trembling with excitement, believing they had touched a deeper truth. And sometimes, indeed, the verses held a strange power and intensity born of both inspiration and intoxication. Yet heroin did not sustain rhythm, it devoured it. What began as streams of words turned into fragments, broken phrases, notebooks filled with abandoned lines. One poet, remembered only in the diary of a friend, would sit for hours before an empty page, the pen unmoving, his eyes vacant. When pressed, he confessed that without heroin he could no longer hear the music of language. His silence became his prison. He drifted from cafe to cafe, his notebooks empty, his reputation fading. By the end, he was remembered not for his poems but for his absence, the silence where words had once been. These stories are not exceptional. They are archetypal. For the painter, heroin first sharpened vision and then blurred it. For the poet, it first opened language and then silenced it. The pattern repeated across disciplines, across lives. What heroin gave at the beginning, it always took away in the end, leaving not balance but deficit. It is striking to consider how many works might have been created had these artists resisted the illusion, the lost canvases. The unwritten verses, the silences that followed are part of the cultural cost of the 1920s heroin wave. History remembers the triumphs of that decade, the dazzling paintings, the revolutionary poems, the novels and plays that reshaped literature. But for every triumph there were failures we cannot measure, because they were never given form. The absence of those works is itself a kind of silent testimony, etched not in stone, but in what is missing from our libraries and galleries. Friends of these artists often struggled with how to respond. Some dismissed heroin as just another indulgence, no different from absinthe or opium, a fashionable risk of the avant-garde. Others tried to intervene, urging their companions to abandon the drug, offering money or companionship as substitutes. But addiction is not easily persuaded. The painter returned to his studio, the poet to his empty notebook. Each believed, against all evidence, that the muse would return if only they stayed faithful to the drug that had betrayed them. Jean Cocteau's survival stands out not because he was stronger, but because he was willing to confess. His journals, filled with contradictions, revealed both the seduction and the torment. He admitted that heroin gave him visions, but also described mornings of despair, when even light itself felt unbearable. His honesty provided a rare window into what so many endured in silence. He showed that heroin did not enhance creation, but enslaved it. His words, preserved, allow us to see clearly what the painter's trembling hand and the poet's silence could not express. The cafes of Montparnasse were filled with ghosts. Even before the artists had died, a chair left empty at a familiar table, a notebook abandoned on a shelf, a canvas sold for a fraction of its worth. The absence of these artists was felt in the very spaces they had once animated. Their friends carried on, but the silence was heavy, reminding everyone that brilliance could vanish overnight, not through lack of talent, but through illusions too seductive to resist. In remembering the painter's illusion and the poet's silence, we see the essence of Heroin's seduction. It did not simply destroy bodies, it distorted the very process of creation. It offered artists the promise of inspiration and then stole from them the ability to create. It turned vision into blur, rhythm into silence, and left behind only fragments of what might have been dot and yet, in their tragedies, there is also a lesson for us who look back. It is a reminder that every gift must be pursued with patience, that brilliance cannot be rushed, that inspiration cannot be forced. The artists of 1920s Paris longed for shortcuts to eternity, and Heroin promised them. But eternity does not belong to shortcuts. It belongs to the slow, steady work of those who endure. If painters sought vision and poets sought rhythm, the musicians of Paris in the 1920s sought endurance. Jazz demanded not only skill, but stamina, to play through the night in smoke-filled clubs, to keep pace with the fever of dancers and the endless calls for encores, required more than talent. It required strength that few could sustain. And so, for many musicians, Heroin seemed less a vice than a bargainer pact that promised the energy to keep playing, to keep the music alive, to keep the crowd on its feet. The bargain began innocently enough. A clarinetist, weary after a week of performances, accepted a viol from a friend with the assurance that it would ease his fatigue. The first night, it worked. His fingers moved with unusual agility. His breath flowed without strain, and his improvisation soared. The crowd shouted, applauded, demanded more. He left the stage believing he had discovered a secret weapon. The bargain had been struck. Energy and brilliance tonight, in exchange for nothing, or so it seemed. In Montmartre's clubs, musicians lived in a world of relentless demand. Audiences expected not only music, but magic. They wanted to be lifted, transported, shaken free of the ordinary. A band might begin at 10 in the evening and still be playing as dawn colored the sky. Musicians sweated beneath the heat of lamps, their shirts clinging to their bodies, their lips raw from hours of blowing into brass. Drummers' arms ached, pianists' backs throbbed. Yet the music had to continue. In such conditions, Heroin appeared as salvation, just enough to take the edge off, to steady the body. To push through one more chorus, Sidney Beckett, one of the towering figures of jazz in Paris, did not himself depend on Heroin, but he witnessed its presence all around him. Younger musicians, less disciplined, less experienced, fell prey to its promises. Some confided to him that the drug made them feel invincible, as though their instruments were extensions of their own bodies, as though music flowed through them without effort. For a while, it was true. Their solos burned with intensity. Their improvisations dazzled. Crowds marveled. Critics raved. And the musicians themselves believed they had found the key to endless inspiration. But the bargain was never fair. Heroin demanded repayment. Soon the clarinetist who once played with brilliance found his fingers sluggish without the drug. The trumpeter who once soared through endless choruses could barely hold a note. The drummer who once drove the band with relentless rhythm lost the ability to keep time. The very energy they had sought to preserve now depended on heroin, and when it failed them, the silence was devastating. The decline often came quietly, a missed rehearsal here, a faltering. Note there, fellow musicians noticed but said little, unwilling to confront what they themselves sometimes shared. Audiences sensed something was wrong but could not name it. The once brilliant soloist seemed distracted, the rhythm less sharp, the energy muted. For the musicians, the fear was not only of losing their craft but of losing their identity. They were not merely men who played instruments. They were music itself. To imagine silence was to imagine death, and so they clung to heroin, even as it stole the very gift it once seemed to enhance. There is a peculiar cruelty in this bargain. For the musician, heroin did not only consume the body, but also distorted the relationship with music. What had once been joy became necessity. The clarinetist no longer played because he loved the sound, but because he could not bear silence. The trumpeter no longer sought brilliance, but relief. The drummer no longer drove the rhythm for the dancers, but for his own survival. The music, once an offering to the world, became a transaction with the drug dot in the dim back rooms of clubs. Where the air was heavy with smoke and spilled wine, musicians whispered of their struggles. Some confessed to one another in hushed tones, their instruments resting silently beside them. Others hid their dependency fiercely, ashamed of the weakness it revealed. A few managed to break free, often after great suffering, but many did not. Their names faded from posters, their instruments pawned, their places on stage filled by others. The bargain had been broken, and the cost was their silence. Yet even in decline, there were moments of brilliance. Listeners recall performances where a musician, though weakened, seemed to burn with desperate intensity, as if pouring the last of his life into a single solo. These moments were unforgettable music, infused not with ease, but with struggle, beauty carved out of despair. Such performances haunt memory because they reveal both the gift and the cost, the genius and the ruin, inseparable in a single breath. The broader jazz community in Paris bore the scars of these bargains. Bands broke apart when key members could no longer perform. Promising talents vanished, their absence felt but rarely explained. The fever of jazz continued, but beneath its rhythm lay sorrow, whispered in conversations after shows, carried in the tired eyes of musicians who knew too well what heroin demanded. The story of the musician's bargain is not merely about addiction. It is about the human desire to transcend limits. Music demands everything from those who serve it, and the temptation to find shortcuts is eternal. In Paris of the 1920s, heroin presented itself as the shortcut par excellence. It promised stamina, inspiration, and brilliance, and for a time it delivered. But in the end, it consumed the very soul of the music it claimed to enhance. We, who listen now to the recordings of that era, must remember that behind the brilliance of those notes were lives lived on the edge of ruin. The music survives, eternal, etched into grooves of vinyl and carried across decades. But the men who played it, many of them, did not survive. Their bargain with heroin left them silenced, their instruments abandoned, their names forgotten. And yet, in their story lies a truth as haunting as any melody. It is that brilliance and destruction often walk together, that the hunger for transcendence can lead both to creation and to ruin. The musicians of Paris remind us that art is never free. It always demands a price. For some, the price was practice, discipline, and endurance. For others, tragically, it was their very lives. Addiction rarely confines itself to the solitude of an individual. It spreads outward, weaving itself into the lives of companions, patrons, and admirers. In Paris of the 1920s, heroin was not only an artist's secret, it was a shared condition, a contagion of habit that bound together circles of friends and communities of creation. What began with one painter or musician soon touched others, until entire gatherings carried within them the invisible thread of dependency. In Montparnasse cafes, it often began with a gesture of generosity. A poet, flush with inspiration, and a small vial purchased from a pharmacist, would offer a taste to his companion. "Try," he would say, with the conviction of one who believed he had discovered a treasure. The friend, hesitant at first, would accept out of curiosity or out of trust in the intimacy of the moment. Soon, what had been an individual indulgence became a communal ritual. The passing of cigarettes, the raising of glasses, the sharing of heroin all became part of the same choreography of companionship. Patrons, too, were drawn into these circles. Wealthy men and women who sponsored artists often saw themselves not only as benefactors, but as participants in their bohemian world. They funded studios, paid for dinners, purchased canvases, but they also sought to share in the secrets of creativity, to sit with a celebrated painter or poet, to partake in the same indulgences, was to feel oneself part of the mystery of genius. Heroin, in this context, was not merely a drug. It was a key to belonging, to intimacy with the creative spirit. Patrons who once imagined themselves as guardians of art found themselves, instead, entangled in its ruin. Theaters and clubs bore witness to similar patterns. Backstage, before the curtain rose, actors gathered in dressing rooms filled with the smell of powder and paint. Among the rouge and sequins, small vials appeared, passed quietly from hand to hand. To partake was to steady the nerves, but it was also to remain part of the circle. To refuse was to risk exclusion, to separate oneself from companions whose bonds were sealed not only by shared performance, but by shared dependency. The same was true among musicians, where bands traveling together found that heroin, once introduced, became part of their unspoken pact. The spread was not limited to the artists themselves. Lovers and admirers, eager to share in the intimacy of their beloved's world, often followed them into dependency. A painter's mistress, persuaded that heroin revealed the depths of his vision, tried it herself to remain close. A poet's lover, afraid of losing him to the solitude of intoxication, joined him in his ritual. What began as devotion became enslavement. Thus, heroin did not merely ruin individual lives, but corrupted the bonds of affection, turning love into complicity, admiration into silence. In these circles, silence was perhaps the most dangerous element. Friends who noticed decline rarely spoke directly. They excused trembling hands as fatigue, missed performances as eccentricity, absent friends as victims of temporary melancholy. To speak plainly was to risk breaking the fragile bonds of the group, to expose not only one's companion, but oneself. And so the silence grew, allowing heroin to spread unchecked. Jean Cocteau, who survived long enough to reflect, observed that heroin carried with it a peculiar intimacy. Those who shared it felt bound together by an invisible thread, as though they had entered a secret society. The secrecy itself heightened the bond. What they did could not be spoken of openly, and so they relied upon one another for both companionship and concealment. But such intimacy was treacherous, for it was built not on strength but on weakness, not on freedom but on dependency. The consequences of these circles of dependency rippled outward. An entire troupe of dancers might decline when one leading figure introduced the habit. A cafe known for its brilliant conversations might fall silent as its central voices faded into absence. A patron, once generous, might withdraw from public life, leaving artists without support. In this way, heroin not only ruined individuals, but destabilized entire communities of creativity. There were exceptions: those who resisted, who warned, who refused to join. Some writers insisted on discipline, some musicians on sobriety, some patrons on discretion, but their voices were often drowned out by the laughter of those still enchanted by the illusion. To many, heroin still seemed a private choice, not a communal threat. Only when the decline became visible, when performances collapsed, when salons fell silent, when studios stood abandoned, did the truth emerge. The ruin had never been solitary. It had always been shared. The tragedy of these circles lies in how they inverted the very purpose of community. Artists and patrons gathered to inspire, to support, to challenge one another toward brilliance. Instead, heroin transformed those bonds into chains of complicity, dragging many down together. What was meant to be a circle of creation became a circle of dependency, closed in upon itself. It is here that we glimpse one of the darker truths of Montmartre's glittering age. That brilliance often concealed not only individual ruin, but collective collapse. The laughter of a cafe, the applause of a theater, the clinking of glasses, all could mask the quiet erosion of an entire circle of friends, bound together by heroin. Their decline was not loud, not dramatic. It unfolded in silence, in absences, in names forgotten from posters and canvases left unfinished. When we remember Paris of the 1920s, we must recall not only the great individuals, but also the communities they formed. These circles of dependency reveal that art is never created in isolation. It emerges from groups bound together by love, rivalry, support, and, tragically, sometimes by addiction. The heroine of that decade reminds us that even the most brilliant circles can collapse when the bonds that unite them are poisoned. And yet, even in their ruin, there is a lesson. The artists of Paris remind us that community is both our strength and our vulnerability. The same closeness that fosters inspiration can also spread destruction. To belong is to share not only joy but also sorrow, not only creation, but also decline. The story of these circles is not only about heroin, it is about the fragile nature of human connection itself. The story of prison artists in the 1920s is often remembered for brilliance, for canvases that broke tradition, for poems that shattered rhythm, for music that set the world on fire. But beneath the triumph lies another story, the story of chains. These chains were not forged of iron, but of habit, of illusion, of dependency. They bound painters to trembling hands, poets to silence, musicians to faltering notes, and entire circles of friends to a slow and shared ruin. Heroin's cruelty was that it disguised its chains as wings. At first, the artist believed he had discovered freedom from fatigue, from doubt, from the fear of silence. The brush moved swiftly, the pen flowed, the instrument sang. But over time, the wings grew heavy, until the artist realized they were shackles. To create without heroin became impossible. What had once been a choice turned into compulsion, and compulsion is the opposite of freedom. Consider the painter whose canvases once glowed with strange light. In his early days, with heroin, he worked furiously, convinced that visions poured into him from beyond. His patrons praised his daring. His friends admired his courage. But within a few years, he could not lift a brush without first seeking the drug. The visions blurred. The canvases grew darker, and finally, the studio fell silent. His chains were invisible, yet they held him as firmly as any prison. Or the poet, who once recited verses in the cafes of Montparnasse, filling notebooks with images of fire and rain. At first, heroin gave him fluency, words tumbling as though whispered by the gods. But soon the words faltered. The drug no longer brought inspiration, only silence. His notebook remained empty, his pen still. Friends avoided asking, for they knew the answer. The poet was chained to heroin, unable to speak except in sighs. His silence was not natural. It was enforced by the weight of his dependency. The musicians carried their chains onto the stage itself. Jazz demanded energy, passion, endurance. Heroin promised to deliver these, and at first it did. But when the drug became master, the music faltered. A clarinetist who once dazzled with improvisations now played sluggishly without his dose. A trumpeter once known for brilliance could not hold a note. A drummer once steady as a heartbeat lost the rhythm entirely. The audience clapped politely, not realizing that what they heard was the sound of chains rattling in the background. The most tragic chains were those shared by entire circles of friends, in cafes, in studios, in backstage dressing rooms. Heroin passed quietly, binding companions together in dependency. The intimacy of sharing became complicity, and the silence that followed became collective. No one wished to break the spell. No one dared to name the ruin aloud, and so they sank together, each reinforcing the other's chains. What might have been communities of inspiration became communities of decline. These chains reached even to patrons, those who believed themselves above the struggles of the artists they supported. They, too, sought intimacy with genius, and in doing so, they accepted heroin as part of the price. Their wealth concealed their decline for a time, but the outcome was no different. Heroin did not respect class, talent, or reputation. Its chains bound all who welcomed it. What is most striking in these stories is not only the destruction, but the quietness of it. There were few dramatic collapses, few public scandals. The ruin came slowly, invisibly, like ivy creeping along a wall. A missed performance here, an unfinished canvas there, a silence in the cafe where once there was laughter. The chains did not clang, they whispered. And perhaps that is why so few noticed until it was too late. In reflecting upon these chains, we are reminded of the fragility of art itself. Creation is not inevitable. It requires freedom of mind, clarity of vision, steadiness of hand. Anything that compromises these is an enemy of art, no matter how seductive its promises. Heroin disguised itself as a muse, but it was in truth a thief. It stole from Paris not only individual lives, but also unwritten books, unpainted canvases, unsung songs. Its chains extended beyond those who wore them. They reached into history itself, leaving absences we can never fill. And yet, there is also a lesson in survival. Jean Cocteau, who bore his chains but lived to describe them, teaches us that confession can break silence. By naming his dependency, he loosened its grip, and in doing so, he offered others a warning. His survival shows that while chains are strong, they are not unbreakable. His honesty reminds us that ruin is not inevitable, that courage can be found even in despair. As we close this chapter, we must hold both truths together: the brilliance of Parisian artists and the chains that bound them. To celebrate one without acknowledging the other is to distort the past. The glitter of the 1920s shines brighter when we see it against the shadows, and the shadows grow heavier when contrasted with the light. Only in seeing both do we honor the full truth of what was gained and what was lost. And so the City of Lights, in those years, was also the city of chains. Behind the laughter, behind the music, behind the glitter, Heroin wound itself around artists and patrons alike. Its chains were invisible, but they left marks that time has not erased. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. When we think of Heroin in 1920s Paris, our minds are drawn first to the artists, the painters with trembling hands, the poets silenced by empty pages, the musicians whose instruments fell quiet. Yet the story did not end at the edge of Montmartre's stages or Montparnasse's studios. Heroin seeped further, flowing quietly into the broader circle of Parisian life. It touched students in the Latin Quarter, clerks in government offices, heirs in gilded salons, and seamstresses in cramped apartments. Addiction was not only the tragedy of art, it was a condition of society. To understand this wider circle, one must picture Paris in its daily rhythms. In the mornings, the boulevards filled with trams, their bells clanging above the rattle of wheels. The scent of baking bread rose from corner bakeries, mingling with the metallic tang of horse-drawn carts carrying milk or coal. Men in suits hurried toward offices, their hats tilted against the sun. Women in long coats carried baskets through markets, bargaining for fish and vegetables. Paris, by daylight, was not the glittering city of cabarets, but the practical city of labor, sustenance, and survival. Yet even here, Heroin appeared. In the Latin Quarter, students lived in cheap pensions, their walls thin, their rooms barely furnished. Many had come from abroad America, England, Italy, drawn by the prestige of the Sorbonne and the allure of Parisian life. Their days were spent in lecture halls, but their nights belonged to the cafes, where debates stretched past midnight, smoke thickened the air, and cheap wine dulled their hunger. It was among these restless youths that heroin often surfaced. A friend offered it as a cure for fatigue, as a way to extend the night, as a mark of belonging to a daring set. What began as curiosity hardened quickly into dependency. Professors noted absences, landlords complained of unpaid rents, and letters were sent home to families who could not understand why their brilliant children had suddenly faltered. Clerks and secretaries, too, found themselves within heroin's reach. Paris in the 1920s was a city of bureaucracy, ministries, banks, and firms that required endless paperwork. Days stretched long under fluorescent lamps, the sound of pens scratching across ledgers, the air heavy with dust and ink. For some, heroin offered relief from monotony. A small vial tucked into a desk drawer promised escape from fatigue, a moment of lightness in the drudgery. Their decline was quieter than that of artists. No canvases remained unfinished, no novels unwritten. Instead, their absence was felt in stacks of delayed files, in mistakes in calculations, in sudden resignations explained away as ill health. They vanished not into legend, but into anonymity. In salons of the wealthy, heroin wore a different disguise for aristocrats and nouveau riches. The 1920s were a time of endless parties, a chance to display opulence after years of war austerity. Their evenings glittered with chandeliers, string quartets, and tables laden with silver and crystal. Yet even amid this splendor, ennui lingered. For heirs and heiresses who had never known want, heroin offered novelty, a new thrill to punctuate the monotony of privilege, passed discreetly among friends, hidden in jeweled cases. It was consumed with the same nonchalance as cognac or cigars, but its effects were less easily concealed. Families whispered about daughters who grew pale and nervous, sons who neglected their duties, fortunes jeopardized by heirs too frail to manage them. The scandals were contained, hushed by wealth, but the truth was undeniable. Heroin respected no class. In working class neighborhoods, heroin's presence was more insidious. Seamstresses, waiters, laborers, those who carried the weight of the city's daily life, rarely sought the drug as indulgence. Instead, it entered through desperation. An injured worker prescribed heroin for pain continued its use long after the wound had healed. A maid offered relief for exhaustion, found herself unable to rise without it. For the poor, addiction brought not only decline, but ruin. For there was no wealth to shield them from consequence. Arrests, evictions, and hospitalizations marked their path. Their stories seldom reached the newspapers, but their absence was felt in factories, in markets, in homes suddenly without income. The police and authorities remained largely indifferent. Their attention was fixed on visible disturbances, drunken fights, strikes, theft. Heroin, exchanged quietly, caused little public disorder. To name it as a problem would have been to admit its breadth, and such an admission threatened the city's carefully cultivated image as the capital of pleasure. And so the broader circle bore its suffering in silence. Students were sent home in disgrace, clerks dismissed, servants replaced, aristocrats hidden from view. Each case seemed isolated, but together they formed a pattern, a hidden epidemic, woven into the very fabric of prison life. What makes this broader circle so haunting is its invisibility. The artists, at least, left traces, canvases, journals, performances remembered. But the clerk who faltered at his desk, the student who failed his examinations, the maid dismissed from service, these left little record. Their lives disappeared into silence, and history seldom recalls them. Yet they, too, were part of Paris, part of the city's rhythm, part of its loss. To walk through Paris today is to see only the surface of that era's memory, the art, the music, the glamour. But if one listens carefully, perhaps in the hush of the Latin Quarter at dusk, or in the echo of footsteps through a forgotten alley, one can almost hear the absences, the conversations that were never finished, the laughter that fell quiet, the futures that dissolved. The broader Parisian circle reminds us that Heroin's shadow was not confined to stages and studios. It touched every layer of society, leaving behind not only brilliance undone, but ordinary lives unfulfilled. And so, as we widen our gaze beyond the artists, we see more clearly the scope of Paris's tragedy. The city of lights glittered, yes, but the shadow fell upon all who lived within its, students, workers, aristocrats alike. In this, Heroin was a true equalizer, binding together lives otherwise separated by wealth, status, and ambition. It showed that ruin is not only the fate of the brilliant, but also of the ordinary, and that every glittering age conceals a darkness shared by all. If Montmartre was the city's stage of glitter, then the Latin Quarter was its workshop of ideas. Here the young gathered, carrying notebooks instead of instruments, philosophy instead of choreography. The narrow streets echoed not with jazz, but with debate, footsteps hurrying toward lectures, and the clatter of dishes in cheap cafes. The scent was different to not the perfume and champagne of cabarets, but the bitter aroma of strong coffee, damp books, and ink-stained fingers. The Latin Quarter was less about spectacle and more about the quiet labor of thought. Yet it was precisely here, among the restless students, that Heroin found fertile ground. The universities drew young men and women from across the world. Americans, eager for a freedom denied them by prohibition, crossed the Atlantic to taste the intellectual and social liberties of Paris. Italians, Spaniards, and Russians came in search of new philosophies, fleeing regimes that stifled their voices. French students themselves, weary of the war's aftermath, sought meaning in classrooms where professors debated metaphysics and history. The energy of youth filled the air. Cafes near the Sorbonne overflowed with voices rising in argument, laughter, and recitation of half-finished poems. But youth, for all its brilliance, carries with it vulnerability. The same hunger for experience that led students to philosophy and politics also made them curious about substances that promised new sensations. Heroin entered their lives less as medicine and more as adventure. A vial passed across a table, a friend whispering of serenity, A late-night experiment. After hours of debate, it seemed, at first, harmless. To try was to prove courage, to show one belonged to the daring set. One can imagine this scene in a smoky cafe, a group of students crowded around a table. Cups of coffee gone cold, papers scattered with ink smudges. A friend produces a small packet, speaks of clarity and calm. Another laughs nervously, then accepts. Eager not to appear timid, the gesture is repeated the following week, then the week after, until it becomes ritual. Soon heroin is woven into the very fabric of their gatherings, as common as cigarettes, as unremarkable as wine. Professors began to notice the changes. A student once lively in debate grew quiet. His essays submitted late, his eyes vacant in lectures. Another, once promising in mathematics, failed examinations, his papers incoherent. A young woman who had dreamed of writing novels withdrew from class entirely, her friends speaking vaguely of illness. The Latin Quarter, once alive with energy, bore within its silences that no one wished to name. The tragedy of student addiction was compounded by distance. Many came from abroad, their families far away, their support fragile. Letters home spoke of studies, of prison life, but seldom of heroin. Parents, proud of their children's adventures, remained ignorant of the shadows consuming them. Some students disappeared quietly, returning home without degrees, their potential unfulfilled. Others stayed but drifted, their names absent from graduation lists, their futures dissolving in the haze of dependency. Landlords, too, saw the signs. In the small pensions of the Latin Quarter, rooms filled with the smell of unwashed clothes and spilled ink. Rent went unpaid, books and belongings pawned for money. Neighbors whispered of students who slept through the day, who grew pale and thin, who vanished for weeks at a time. But Paris was accustomed to eccentricity, and many dismissed these as the natural excesses of bohemian life. Few recognized that behind the eccentricity lay ruin. Among the students themselves, the silence was most devastating. Friendship in the Latin Quarter was fierce. Debates lasted until dawn. Loyalty was sworn in arguments and reconciliations. Yet heroin introduced a secrecy that fractured these bonds. Those who used often concealed it from those who did not. Those who suspected hesitated to speak, fearing they would lose the intimacy of the circle. And so the silence deepened, and heroin spread. There were, of course, exceptions. Some resisted, clinging to discipline, focusing on their studies, aware of the dangers. Others tried to save their friends, offering money, encouragement, or confrontation. But resistance was difficult, for the allure of heroin lay not only in its effects but in its role as symbol. To partake was to declare oneself modern, courageous, unafraid of taboos. In a generation eager to break with the past, this mattered deeply. The students of the Latin Quarter did not see themselves as victims, but as pioneers. Until the illusion collapsed. By the late 1920s, the universities began to feel the cost. Records show rising numbers of students failing to complete their degrees, dropping out without explanation. Professors whispered of a malaise spreading among the young. Though they seldom named heroin directly, the Latin Quarter's cafes, once remembered for fiery debates, became known also for their silences, for students staring blankly at notebooks they could no longer fill. What makes the story of these students so haunting is not only their decline, but their anonymity. Unlike celebrated artists, they left few traces. Their works remained unpublished, their debates unrecorded, their names absent from history. They exist now only as shadows in memoirs, as footnotes in police or university archives, as whispers in letters long forgotten. Yet their loss was immense. Each represented a future unfulfilled, a doctor never trained, a writer never published, a teacher never returned home. The Latin Quarter, in those years, held both brilliance and sorrow. By day, lectures filled with eager minds. By night, cafes glittered with youthful energy. But beneath the surface, heroin crept silently, stealing potential before it could blossom. To walk through those streets today, with their bookstores and cafes still alive, is to walk upon layers of memory of voices raised in debate and of voices silenced too soon. The students of the Latin Quarter remind us that heroin in 1920s Paris was not confined to artists and performers. It reached into the lives of the young and ambitious, those who sought knowledge and change. Their tragedy was not only personal, but generational, for every student lost to heroin, a fragment of the future was lost as well. And so the broader circle of Paris bore the same burden as the artists, the chains of dependency, the silence of potential undone. If the Latin Quarter revealed heroin's quiet invasion of youth and ambition, the salons of Paris showed how it seeped into the gilded world of wealth and privilege. The aristocrats of the 1920s, though diminished in political power, still held sway in culture and society. Their salons were the glittering chambers where art, music, and politics intertwined. Beneath chandeliers and mirrored walls, conversations flowed like wine, and it was in these elegant rooms that heroin, too, found a place at the table. The salons themselves were masterpieces of refinement. Along the boulevard Haussmann and in the mansions of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, guests entered through marble halls, their footsteps echoing beneath painted ceilings. Perfume mingled with the faint smoke of cigars, and crystal glasses sparkled on silver trays. Hostesses greeted their guests with practiced smiles, their gowns shimmering in the glow of candelabras. Here, one might find a duchess in conversation with a composer, a banker listening to a poet, or a politician whispering with a painter. The salons existed to display brilliance, to gather beauty and intellect in one room, to remind Paris that its aristocracy still commanded attention. Yet brilliance is often accompanied by ennui. For many heirs and heiresses, wealth provided everything but meaning. They had known neither hunger nor hardship, and the abundance of privilege left them restless. Parties, concerts, and endless conversations dulled over time. No matter how glittering the company, into this weariness slipped heroin, first as curiosity, then as fashion. A discreet vial, presented in a jeweled case, might be passed as casually as a box of cigarettes. To partake was not considered scandalous but daring, a mark of sophistication, a signal that one belonged to the innermost circle of Parisian modernity. The ritual of heroin in the salons differed from its use in Montmartre or the Latin Quarter. There it was sought for inspiration or escape. Here it was consumed for novelty. Aristocrats, surrounded by luxury, desired experiences that money alone could not buy. Heroin, whispered of in avant-garde circles, promised a doorway into the forbidden. To share it was to bind oneself more closely to companions, to prove that even in opulence one could court danger. In this way, heroin became a performance within the salons, an unspoken drama enacted between gilded walls. Families, of course, noticed the consequences. Daughters once lively grew pale and withdrawn, their beauty fading into nervous fragility. Sons expected to manage estates or banking houses became unreliable, distracted, and careless. Yet discretion was paramount. Illness was the word whispered, never addiction. A young woman's absence from society was explained as nervous exhaustion. A young man's failures were attributed to travel, to melancholia, to vague matters of health. Wealth provided the means to conceal decline, but it could not prevent it. The same chains that bound the poor bound the rich, though they rattled more softly behind velvet curtains. In some cases, entire circles fell together. A salon once renowned for its lively discussions grew quiet. As its central figures succumbed to dependency, guests noticed absences, the sparkle of conversation dimming. But Paris society, eager to maintain appearances, preferred silence. Gossip filled the boulevards about affairs, rivalries, or scandals. But the word heroin was seldom spoken. To admit its presence was to risk staining the image of refinement that the salons worked so hard to maintain. The aristocrats were not alone in their indulgence. Patrons of the arts, eager to share in the intimacy of their protégés, followed them into heroin's embrace. A banker sponsoring a painter might accept a vial as a token of friendship. A duchess supporting a theater troupe might join her performers in the ritual, believing it a gesture of solidarity. Thus, heroin leapt from stage to salon, from bohemian quarters to gilded mansions, carried not by necessity, but by fashion, not by desperation, but by curiosity. The spread revealed that addiction was not confined by class. The same illusion of control seduced both the impoverished student and the wealthy heir. The tragedy of heroin in the salons lay in its waste of potential influence. Aristocrats who might have shaped culture, funded great projects, or supported social reform withdrew instead into private decline. Their salons, once centers of intellectual energy, grew hollow. The wealth that might have nurtured art was spent on indulgence. The voices that might have steered society were silenced by dependency. In this sense, heroin robbed Paris not only of art, but of leadership, not only of creativity, but of responsibility. And yet, even within this ruin, the salons glittered on. Guests continued to arrive in carriages. Musicians still played beneath crystal chandeliers. Laughter echoed through marble halls. Outsiders, peering in, saw only elegance. They did not see the pale faces, the trembling hands, the empty eyes. The city of lights guarded its illusions carefully, ensuring that the brilliance of its aristocracy remained untarnished in public. Only history, with the benefit of hindsight, reveals the shadows behind the chandeliers. The aristocrats and their salons remind us that heroin in 1920s Paris was not only an artist's tragedy or a student's experiment. It was also a disease of privilege, a poison of wealth, a shadow cast upon the very heights of society. It shows us that no class, however gilded, is immune to illusions, and that the desire for novelty can be as dangerous as the desire for escape today. When we walk through the grand boulevards of Paris, past the mansions and hôtels particuliers, we see only their facade stone walls, wrought iron balconies, ornate gates. Behind those walls, nearly a century ago, heroin passed discreetly among the privileged, binding them in the same chains as their poorer neighbors. Their silence reminds us that addiction is not only a private ruin, but a social one, capable of hollowing out even the brightest circles of influence. Beneath the glitter of salons and the laughter of Montmartre lay another Paris, one less often remembered, the Paris of the working poor. Their lives unfolded not in theaters or universities, but in factories, markets, laundries, and the cramped apartments of overcrowded neighborhoods. It was here, among those who carried the daily burdens of the city, that heroin appeared in its most silent and devastating form. Unlike the artists who sought inspiration or the aristocrats who sought novelty, the working poor encountered heroin through desperation, through prescriptions meant to ease pain, through quiet exchanges that promised relief from exhaustion. The mornings in these quarters began before dawn. Chimneys smoked, carts rattled, and the narrow streets echoed with the cries of vendors. Women hurried to market with baskets balanced on their hips. Men filed into factories, their boots leaving, muddy tracks on cobblestones still slick from the night's rain. Children, their faces pale from poor diets, darted through alleys, carrying errands for a few coins. The smell of coal smoke, damp linen, and fried onions filled the air. For these families, life was a constant negotiation with poverty. How to stretch a loaf of bread, how to keep rent paid, how to survive another month. Heroin entered quietly, often through doctors. A seamstress suffering from back pain after long hours at her machine was given a vial to ease her suffering. A laborer injured in a factory accident was prescribed the same. In those days, the boundaries between medicine and poison were not clearly marked. Patients trusted their doctors, believing the prescriptions were safe, and indeed, at first they seemed to help. The seamstress returned to work. The laborer found sleep without pain. But when the bottles ran empty, both discovered they could not manage without them. What began as relief became necessity, and necessity turned to dependency. Unlike the artists, the poor did not romanticize heroin. They did not speak of inspiration or visions. For them, it was survival, a way to keep working, to endure hunger, to face another day of labor. But the cost was no less cruel. A mother who once cared for her children grew distant, her eyes clouded. A father who once carried heavy loads grew frail, his strength gone. Families fractured under the weight of addiction. Children sent to neighbors or orphanages when parents could no longer provide. The working poor had no salons to conceal their decline, no wealth to disguise their absence. Their suffering was visible on the streets, though often dismissed as mere poverty. Landlords complained of unpaid rent. Employers fired workers who faltered. Neighbors whispered but rarely intervened. Police, when they noticed at all, treated addiction as crime rather than illness. Arrests were made, but prisons offered no cure, only further despair. For the poor, heroin was not only a chain but a trap, one from which escape was nearly impossible. Markets bore witness to the consequences. Vendors spoke of familiar faces disappearing, of women who once bought vegetables daily now absent for weeks. Laundries, once filled with chatter, fell silent as workers succumbed to fatigue. In factories, accidents increased as men grew careless or weak. The rhythm of working-class life, already fragile, was disrupted by a poison that consumed not only individuals but entire households. Yet even in these struggles, there were moments of quiet resilience. Neighbors sometimes shared food with children left hungry. Women formed small networks to care for one another. Priests offered counsel to families in despair. But such efforts, though noble, could not overcome the grip of addiction. The poison moved faster than charity, and the silence of shame kept many from seeking help. The working poor bore their burdens alone, their tragedies unrecorded, their names absent from history. It is striking to compare their fate with that of the artists and aristocrats. For the wealthy, heroin was a hidden indulgence. For the artists, it was a seductive muse. For the poor, it was a cruel necessity, a false cure that deepened their suffering. Yet in all cases, the outcome was the same: dependency, decline, silence. Heroin's chains were blind to status, though the poor bore them most visibly and most harshly. The silent struggles of the working poor reveal another dimension of Paris's tragedy. While the city glittered for tourists, while jazz thrilled the night, countless families endured decline behind closed doors. Their absence from history books does not diminish their significance. They, too, were part of Paris, part of the rhythm of its markets and factories, part of the loss that heroin inflicted. Their stories remind us that addiction is not only the ruin of individuals, but the erosion of communities, of families, of entire neighborhoods. To walk today through the outer arrondissements, past old factories converted into apartments, past markets still alive with voices, is to sense echoes of those silent struggles. The cobblestones remember footsteps of workers hurrying at dawn. The walls remember cries of children left alone. The air remembers the heavy silence of families undone. Their lives may not have left paintings or poems, but they left traces in the very fabric of the city. The working poor of Paris remind us that heroin's tragedy was not confined to the glittering elite or the celebrated artist. It was also the tragedy of ordinary men and women whose only desire was to endure. Their struggles, though unrecorded, were no less real, no less devastating. In their silence, we hear the broader truth of Paris in the 1920s, that every glittering age conceals a hidden suffering, and that the brilliance of the City of Lights was sustained by lives carried quietly in the shadows. Heroin's journey through Paris in the 1920s did not rive with explosions or revolutions. It spread quietly threading its way through the city's many layers. As discreet as candle smoke rising into rafters, it moved from the cafes of Montmartre to the student pensions of the Latin Quarter, from the gilded salons of the aristocracy to the cramped apartments of the working poor. Each circle believed itself separate, each carried its own illusions, yet all were bound by the same chain. Addiction was the hidden chorus of the decade, humming beneath the louder music of jazz and laughter. What made the spread so insidious was its invisibility. Paris was accustomed to vice. Wine and cognac were part of every celebration. Absinthe had long been notorious. Opium dens had their reputation. Against these louder indulgences, heroin appeared almost modest. It lacked the spectacle of drunken brawls or the scent of green absinthe swirling in a glass. Its users did not stagger through the streets or shout in anger. They withdrew into silence, into pale faces, into tremors hidden beneath gloves. And so the city dismissed the signs, imagining each case an exception, never daring to see the pattern. But the consequences reached further than individuals. The decline of students in the Latin Quarter weakened the promise of a new generation. Brilliant minds faltered, futures dissolved, and entire classrooms lost their vigor. The aristocracy, retreating into discreet addictions, failed in their role as cultural patrons, leaving salons hollow where once they had nurtured art. The working poor, most vulnerable of all, saw families fractured, children neglected, neighborhoods burdened with loss. Even the artists whose ruin at least left visible fragments of brilliance were only one part of a larger sorrow. The true cost was borne across society, diffuse and unmeasured. Paris itself carried the scars, though hidden. Beneath its brilliance, hospitals recorded rising numbers of nervous ailments, unexplained collapses, fevers without clear cause. Police reports noted arrests for possession. Though they remained cautious in their language, newspapers occasionally reported a scandal, but always framed it as anomaly, never epidemic. The silence was deliberate. Paris, determined to remain the capital of pleasure, refused to acknowledge the shadow that threatened its image. To admit heroin's spread was to admit fragility, and fragility was incompatible with the legend the city offered the world. And yet the people knew. Neighbors whispered of vanished tenants, of children wandering the streets, of daughters pale with illness, of sons who squandered fortunes. Landlords, factory owners, theater managers all saw the signs, but silence prevailed, as silence often does when ruin is both widespread and shameful. In this way, heroin's spread was not only chemical, but cultural. It thrived in secrecy, nourished by denial, protected by the city's desire for illusion. The broader social consequences extended beyond decline into mistrust. Families fractured under the weight of secrecy. Friendships dissolved when silence became unbearable. Communities weakened when too many members faltered at once. Trust, the invisible fabric that binds a city, began to fray. This erosion, though quieter than protests or strikes, was no less dangerous. A society does not collapse only through violence. It can also erode through silence, through the slow decay of responsibility. Heroin's spread also revealed the paradox of equality. In a city so divided by class, It was rare to find a condition that touched both aristocrat and laborer, student and artist. Yet heroin made no distinctions. Its chains bound the wealthy in salons and the poor in factories alike. In this sense, it was a dark equalizer, showing that suffering recognizes no privilege. But the consequences were not equal. The poor bore harsher penalties, their decline visible and unforgivable, while the wealthy concealed theirs behind curtains. Still, the chain was the same, and the silence just as suffocating. Looking back, we see that heroin's quiet spread was a shadow that accompanied the glitter of Paris. In its most celebrated decade, the City of Lights dazzled visitors with its jazz, its fashion, its art, its daring. Yet within its neighborhoods lay absences, silences, and ruins that history too often forgets. To remember only the brilliance is to distort the truth. The real Paris of the 1920s was both glitter and shadow, laughter and silence, creation and decline. What remains for us is reflection. The story of heroin in Paris is not only about the past. It is also about the nature of society itself. Every age has its illusions, its indulgences, its silences. Every city carries within it both brilliance and shadow. The lesson of Paris is not only that heroin ruined lives, but that silence allowed it to spread. That denial turned individual tragedies into a social wound. It reminds us that the health of a community depends not only on its art and pleasure, but also on its willingness to confront what hides in its shadows. And so, as we close this chapter, imagine Paris at dawn. The streets are quiet, the lamps fading, the markets beginning to stir. The laughter of the night has dissolved, and in its place remains the hush of ordinary life. Beneath this quiet lies another silence, the silence of heroin's spread, of lives undone, of futures lost. It is a silence history often overlooks, yet one that shaped the very city we remember as glittering. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. Every glittering age carries within it the seeds of its own decline. For Paris in the 1920s, the first signs of collapse appeared not in the salons or theaters, but in the quiet details of daily life: an empty chair in a cafe, a studio door that remained locked, a name missing from a theater bill. These absences, so small at first, grew into patterns that could no longer be ignored. The brilliance of the decade began to falter, its rhythms slowing, its laughter tinged with unease. The artists were among the first to reveal the cracks. A painter once celebrated for bold colors presented canvases muted and unfinished. Critics, once generous, grew puzzled. Was it fatigue, they wondered, or a change of style? They did not see the trembling hand, the vial hidden in a pocket, the long nights spent chasing visions that no longer arrived. A poet who had filled notebooks with daring verses now left his pages blank, his silence disguised as contemplation. Friends excused him, believing he was working in secret. Only later did they realize the silence was permanent. Musicians, too, faltered. A clarinetist known for dazzling improvisations played sluggishly one night, then vanished from the stage. Altogether, his absence was explained as travel, as illness, as anything but the truth. The decline extended beyond the artists. In the Latin Quarter, professors noticed an unusual number of students withdrawing from classes. Names disappeared from registers, essays were left incomplete, examinations failed. Landlords spoke of rooms abandoned, rent unpaid, books left scattered on the floor. These were not isolated cases, but part of a larger erosion, though few admitted. It allowed in aristocratic salons, heirs once seen as the future of their families grew frail and unreliable. Their names ceased to appear in the social columns. Rumors circulated, but discretion prevented direct accusation. Families spoke of illness, never of heroin. For the working poor, the decline was most visible. Factories reported accidents caused by workers too weak or distracted to follow routines. Markets saw familiar faces vanish. Stalls left unattended, children appearing alone to buy bread. Neighbors whispered of families collapsing, of mothers too exhausted to care for their children, of fathers disappearing into prisons or hospitals. Unlike the wealthy, the poor could not conceal their ruin. It played out in public, in hunger and absence, in silence that could not be disguised. The city itself bore witness in subtle ways. Police records show a rise in arrests for possession. Though the language remained cautious, hospital wards filled with patients described as suffering from nervous collapse or chronic exhaustion. Newspapers reported occasional scandals, a singer collapsing backstage, a young man found unconscious in a park, but always framed them as isolated tragedies. Paris guarded its myth fiercely. To acknowledge heroin's spread was to tarnish its reputation as the capital of pleasure. And so the silence persisted, even as the evidence grew. For those who lived through it, the first signs of collapse were often felt as unease rather than catastrophe. A night at the theater seemed less vibrant, a conversation in a cafe less sharp, a salon less lively. The city still glittered, but the brilliance felt strained, as though sustained by habit rather than vitality. The jazz still played, but beneath its rhythm lay an undercurrent of fatigue. Visitors from abroad, dazzled by the surface, seldom noticed, but Parisians who had lived through the decades sensed the change. The endless night was beginning to fade. Jean Cocteau's writings capture this shift with painful clarity. He spoke not only of his own struggles, but of the broader atmosphere of decline. He described mornings when the sunlight itself felt oppressive, when the laughter of the night seemed hollow in memory, when the city's brilliance appeared as illusion. His words, though personal, reflected a wider truth. Paris was tiring, its illusions fraying, its silence heavier than before. What makes this decline so haunting is its quietness. There were no riots, no sudden collapses of institutions, no dramatic events to mark the turning point. Instead, there were small signs, absences, silences, vanishing names that accumulated until the pattern could no longer be denied. Decline, like addiction itself, crept in slowly, invisibly, until it had woven itself into the very fabric of the city. And yet, amidst the collapse, brilliance still lingered. Josephine Baker still danced, Hemingway still wrote, Picasso still painted. The city of lights did not fall into darkness, but the shadows grew longer, and the cost of brilliance became harder to ignore. The legacy of heroin was not that it destroyed Paris, but that it hollowed it, leaving behind absences that no art or laughter could fully conceal. As we reflect on the first signs of collapse, we see more clearly the paradox of the 1920s, a decade at once glittering and fragile, vibrant and exhausted, brilliant and ruinous. Its decline was not a sudden fall, but a slow unraveling. Threads pulled quietly from a fabric woven with too much haste, too much illusion, too much silence. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. There was a time when Montmartre burned, like a constellation above Paris, its cabarets and clubs shining with the brilliance of endless nights. The hill was alive with laughter, music, and the fever of champagne. But by the late 1920s, the brilliance began to fade. The lights still glowed, the orchestra still played, but the energy had shifted. What had once felt eternal now felt fragile, as though the city itself were weary. The first signs of this fading appeared in the cabarets. Audiences, once ravenous for novelty, grew restless. The same jokes, the same dances, the same songs that had thrilled them years earlier now seemed predictable. Managers pushed performers to be bolder, more daring, more shocking. Yet behind the feathers and sequins, the exhaustion of the performers was evident. Dancers no longer leapt with the same vitality. Singers strained to reach notes that once came easily. Comedians laughed too loudly at their own lines to disguise the silence. Of the crowd, Josephine Baker still commanded the stage, her presence enough to ignite a theater. But even she faced pressures to reinvent herself constantly, to remain dazzling in a city that demanded new spectacles each season. Around her, lesser performers fell away. Names once painted on posters vanished, replaced by others who would, in turn, soon disappear. Montmartre's brilliance had always been built on constant renewal, but now the cycle felt more like decay. The music, too, bore the weight of decline. Jazz, which had once electrified Paris, became almost commonplace. What had been daring in 1920 seemed familiar by 1928. The rhythm still pulsed, the horns still wailed, but the fever had cooled. Musicians, worn by years of endless nights, faltered. Some left Paris for other cities, seeking new audiences. Others, bound by heroin or exhaustion, could no longer play with the same fire. Audiences sensed it. Though they did not speak it aloud, the night still glittered, but the glow was dimmer, the shadows deeper. The cafes, once filled with endless debates and laughter, grew quieter. Students failed to appear. Artists withdrew. Conversations circled without energy. The clatter of glasses and the smoke of cigarettes remained, but the vitality was gone. Patrons noticed empty chairs where familiar figures had once sat. Absences became part of the scenery, as though the cafes themselves had grown weary of brilliance. Even the streets reflected the change. The crowds that once surged up the hill at night now thinned. Tourists still came, eager for the legend of Montmartre, but Parisians themselves grew more cautious. The economy tightened, rents rose, and the gaiety of the early decade felt increasingly distant. Police patrols increased, not to chase away laughter, but to manage disorder quietly growing at the city's edges. Montmartre, once the center of joy, began to feel like a stage set, glittering on the surface but hollow within. The fading of Montmartre's lights was not a collapse, but a slow dimming. It mirrored the decline of Heroin's victims across the city, just as an artist's brilliance faded into silence. So too did Montmartre's brilliance fade into weariness. The city still shone, but the shine no longer blinded. Behind the lamps and music lay fatigue, dependency, and sorrow. For those who had lived through the height of Montmartre, the change was painful. Older Parisians remembered the early years with nostalgia, speaking of nights when the music seemed endless, when the laughter shook walls, when the hill itself felt immortal. Younger Parisians, who arrived at the end of the decade, could not understand the legend. To them, Montmartre was lively but ordinary, brilliant but not extraordinary. The myth had already begun to dissolve. Writers of the time captured this sense of fading. Hemingway noted that Paris was always changing, that one could not return to the same cafe or the same conversation twice. Fitzgerald wrote with melancholy about the end of parties, the silence after music. Even Cocteau, who had survived Heroin's grip, described the late 1920s as an era of exhaustion, as though the city itself were addicted to brilliance and now faced its withdrawal. It is easy to imagine walking through Montmartre at dawn in those years. The lamps still burned, but weakly. The cobblestones were littered with cigarette ends and scraps of paper. Yet the air was heavy with silence rather than laughter. A violinist, once brilliant, packed his instrument with trembling hands. A dancer removed her sequined costume, staring into a mirror without recognition. A waiter swept the floor, his broom catching fragments of broken glass, his eyes tired. The hill that had once seemed eternal was, at last, weary. The fading of Montmartre's lights marked more than the decline of a neighborhood. It symbolized the decline of an era. The brilliance of Paris in the 1920s was never meant to last. It was a flame burning too brightly, too quickly. Heroin's presence only hastened the dimming, hollowing lives that might have sustained the brilliance longer. But even without Heroin, the city would have faced fatigue. No night is endless, no music eternal, no glitter permanent. And yet, even as Montmartre's lights faded, their glow remained in memory. Tourists carried home stories of nights that seemed magical. Writers immortalized the cafes, the dancers, the music. Painters captured the colors, photographers froze the laughter. The brilliance survived, not in reality but in legend. Montmartre may have dimmed, but its myth continued to shine, brighter in recollection than it had been in truth. The fading of Montmartre's lights reminds us that decline does not erase brilliance. It transforms it. What was once lived becomes remembered. What was once fleeting becomes eternal in story. The loss is real, but so is the legacy. The hill that once glittered still glows in history, even if its brilliance was short-lived. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. For much of the decade, Paris had lived under an enchantment. The lights of Montmartre, the brilliance of its artists, the rhythm of jazz all conspired to conceal the shadows gathering beneath. Heroin's spread was whispered in private, excused in salons, disguised in prescriptions. But by the late 1920s, the enchantment began to lift. The public, long content to ignore the quiet tragedies around them, slowly awakened to the reality that the glitter of Paris carried a heavy cost. The awakening did not arrive with a single scandal or event. It came, instead, as a series of small revelations, each chipping away at the illusion. Newspapers, once reluctant to tarnish Paris's reputation, began publishing reports of arrests for heroin possession. The articles were brief, often buried beneath headlines of politics or fashion, but their accumulation was unmistakable. A singer detained at the Gare de Lyon, a student discovered unconscious in a pension, an aristocrat's are quietly sent. To a clinic in Switzerland, these fragments formed a pattern. Readers, piecing them together, began to see what the city's silence had long concealed. Hospitals, too, became unwilling witnesses. Doctors recorded rising numbers of patients suffering from nervous disorders or chronic fatigue, terms that masked the reality of addiction. Nurses whispered of young men wasting away, of women trembling in their beds, of patients who returned again and again despite treatment. In the wards, the scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint sweetness of illness, and the silence of patients was heavy with shame. The medical community, bound by discretion, rarely spoke publicly, but the truth circulated in private conversations. Seeping slowly into public awareness, families could no longer conceal the decline of their members. Parents who had once dismissed their child's absence as eccentricity now faced undeniable ruin. Daughters pale and frail, sons unreliable, and withdrawn. These were not mere phases of youth. They were chains. Families with wealth sent their children abroad to clinics or estates, hoping distance might break the habit. Families without means watched in despair as their loved ones slipped beyond their reach. The silence that had once protected them now became impossible to maintain. Prison gossip, always eager for scandal, filled with whispers of heroin. Theater audiences, too, noticed the change. A performer once radiant now faltered on stage. A dancer missed steps. A singer's voice cracked. A comedian lost his timing. At first, the crowd excused these lapses, but as they became frequent, murmurs spread. Newspapers, reluctant to name heroin, described ill health or nervous strain. Yet the public, increasingly aware, connected the dots. The glamour of performance could no longer hide the decline of its stars. The awakening spread to politics, though cautiously. Deputies in the chamber began to discuss the presence of narcotics in France. Citing concerns about public health, reports of smuggling routes through Marseille, of foreign ships carrying opium and heroin, appeared. In debates, committees were formed, though action was slow. Paris, so proud of its reputation as the capital of freedom, hesitated to restrict its own pleasures. But the fact that heroin was spoken of in the halls of government at all marked a change. The silence had cracked for the ordinary citizen. The awakening was personal. It came when a neighbor vanished, when a colleague failed at his post, when a friend grew pale and distant. It came in markets, where women whispered of families undone. It came in factories, where accidents revealed workers too weak to continue. It came in schools, where teachers marked absences without explanation. Slowly, the illusion of endless gaiety dissolved, replaced by recognition of decline. And yet, even as the public awakened, the response was uneven. Some called for compassion, urging that addiction be treated as illness rather than crime. Others demanded punishment, seeing heroin as moral failure rather than social tragedy. Debates grew heated in cafes and newspapers, reflecting not only concern but also confusion. Paris was unsure how to reconcile its image as the capital of brilliance with the reality of its shadows. The awakening was incomplete, marked by denial even as it acknowledged truth. Still, the shift was undeniable. By the end of the decade, heroin was no longer invisible. It was spoken of, if cautiously, in newspapers, in politics, in families. The enchantment had lifted, and with it the innocence of the age. Paris could no longer pretend that its brilliance was untouched by ruin. The city of lights had been revealed in its full complexity, both radiant and shadowed, both glittering and fragile. The public's awakening marked the beginning of legacy. What had once been hidden became memory. What had once been denied became history. Heroin's presence in Paris was no longer a private tragedy, but a social reality, one that shaped the way the decade would be remembered. The glitter of the 1920s could not be separated from its shadows. The two were bound together, inseparable, like light and darkness in the same flame. And so, as the public awakened, the legend of Paris changed. The city remained brilliant, but its brilliance was tempered by sorrow. Its myth endured, but its myth carried a shadow. The awakening did not end the tragedy, but it ensured it would not be forgotten. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. When the decade drew to its slow close, Paris was no longer the same city that had dazzled the world in 1925. The lights of Montmartre dimmed. The cafes of the Latin Quarter grew quieter. The salons of the aristocracy hollowed out. Yet even as decline spread, something remarkable endured: the memory of brilliance. It is one of history's paradoxes that art often outlives the suffering that produced it. That memory preserves the light even when the shadows were just as deep. The legacy of heroin in Paris is not only in the absences it left, but also in the art and stories that survived, carrying both brilliance and sorrow into the future. Writers, more than anyone, preserved the age. Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast immortalized the cafes and streets of the 1920s, filled with the laughter of companions who were already fading. His pages carry the energy of youth, but also the melancholy of remembrance. F. Scott Fitzgerald, in his fiction, captured the intoxication of excess and the inevitable decline that followed. Even in his novels set outside Paris, the echo of those champagne-soaked nights is present, shimmering with both allure and fragility. Jean Cocteau's journals, raw and contradictory, remain perhaps the most direct testimony of heroin's seduction. His confessions laid bare what others concealed: the false promises, the chains, the torment. Through his honesty, future generations could see the shadow behind the glitter. Painters, too, left their fragments. Picasso's canvases from the decade do not show heroin directly, yet their fractured forms seem to echo the fractured spirit of the age. Modigliani, though gone before the 1920s, became a kind of ghostly presence. His life a warning of the bohemian path's dangers, the lesser-known painters, those who fell to heroin's grip, left unfinished works scattered in attics and private collections. These canvases, forgotten by the world, tell their own story of brilliance begun but never fulfilled. Each brushstroke is both a presence and an absence, a reminder of what might have been. Music, perhaps more than any other art, carried the double legacy. The recordings of Sidney Beckett, still alive today, vibrate with the energy of Montmartre's fever. His clarinet wails and sings, capturing nights when the world seemed alive with possibility. Yet behind those notes lies the silence of countless musicians whose names never reached records, whose instruments were pawned, whose lives ended. Quietly, jazz in Paris remains both triumphant and haunted, a sound of liberation shadowed by loss. Memory itself became an art form. Visitors who had danced in Montmartre carried home stories, exaggerating their brilliance until they became legend. Tourists who had walked the boulevards by night recalled Paris as a city where life itself was transformed. These stories, repeated and embellished, created the myth of the City of Lights in its golden age. The myth was not false. Paris had indeed glittered, but it was incomplete. The heroine that dimmed so many lives was seldom mentioned. Myth prefers brilliance to shadow, but truth requires both. The legacy of Heroin also shaped how future generations viewed the decade. The 1920s are remembered not only for jazz, art, and fashion, but also for the fragility that underlay them. Historians speak of the lost generation, not only because of the war, but also because of the illusions that followed. The artists and students undone by Heroin were part of that loss. Though their names are less often remembered, their silence became part of the collective memory, an absence as eloquent as presence. Even the city itself became part of the legacy. Walk today through Montmartre, and the cafes trade on the legend of the 1920s. Posters of Josephine Baker adorn walls. Jazz still plays for tourists. Hemingway's cafes display his name proudly. Yet the cobblestones remember more than legend. They remember the footsteps of those who vanished, the whispers of transactions in dark corners, the silences of locked rooms. Paris carries within it both myth and memory, inseparable, layered like paint on a canvas. What makes the legacy so haunting is its duality. On one side stands brilliance, the novels, the paintings, the music, the legend of a city alive with creativity. On the other side stands absence, the unfinished works, the silenced voices, the communities eroded by Heroin. Both are true. To celebrate only the brilliance is to distort history. To remember only the shadow is to miss the beauty. The legacy of Heroin in 1920s Paris is that both brilliance and ruin are woven together, inseparable, eternal. This duality offers a lesson for our own time. Every age has its illusions, its substances, its escapes. Each generation believes it has discovered new freedoms, new pleasures, new brilliance. And perhaps it has. But history reminds us that brilliance is fragile, that pleasure can conceal ruin, that every glittering age carries shadows. Paris in the 1920s is not only a story of the past, but a mirror for the present. As we reflect on the legacy in art and memory, we see that Heroin did not erase Paris's brilliance. It altered it, deepened it, gave it a shadow that makes the light shine more poignantly. The novels of Hemingway, the music of Beckett, the dances of Baker endure, but so too does the silence of those who vanished. Together, they form the true legacy, a city remembered not only for its glitter, but also for its shadows. Not only for its brilliance, but also for its fragility. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. The story of Heroin in 1920s Paris does not end with the decade. Its echoes linger, reaching beyond the cabarets and cafes, beyond the cemeteries and memories. History is never silent. It speaks across generations, reminding us that brilliance and fragility walk hand in hand. The reflections of that era continue to illuminate our own, offering lessons wrapped in shadows. Paris itself preserves the memory, though often unknowingly. Walk through Montmartre today, and you will see tourists climbing the hill, cameras in hand, eager to find the Paris of legend. Jazz still floats from cafes, paintings line the sidewalks, and cabarets advertise themselves with posters of Josephine Baker, her smile as radiant as ever. The myth of the 1920s remains alive, packaged as romance. Yet beneath the surface, the cobblestones remember more. They remember footsteps that faltered, doors locked against shame, whispers exchanged in back rooms. The city, like memory, carries both presence and absence. The echoes are not confined to Paris. The heroin crisis of the 1920s foreshadowed others to come. Later decades would face their own epidemics, different substances, different names, but the same illusions and the same chains. Each age believed it had discovered something new, only to learn that the pattern was familiar, a substance that promised freedom, but delivered dependency, that offered brilliance, but left silence. In this way, the story of Paris is not only about a city, but about humanity's repeated confrontation with illusion. For artists, the echo is particularly poignant. The painter's trembling hand, the poet's silence, the musician's faltering note all remind us that creation is fragile. Brilliance cannot be forced, and shortcuts to inspiration often lead to ruin. The legacy of Heroin in Paris is a warning to every generation of creators. Art requires patience, discipline, endurance. To pursue brilliance through illusion is to risk losing the very gift one seeks to protect. For society, the echo is broader. The spread of Heroin in Paris revealed how silence enables ruin. Families, unwilling to speak the word, concealed addiction behind vague illnesses. Authorities, eager to protect Paris's reputation, ignored the evidence. Friends, fearful of confrontation, remained quiet. In that silence, Heroin flourished. The lesson is clear. What we refuse to name grows stronger. Denial, no less than indulgence, sustains ruin. And for individuals, the echo is intimate. The story of Paris reminds us that every life carries both light and shadow, that every choice contains both promise and peril. Heroin seduced because it spoke to deep desires for inspiration, for relief, for novelty, for belonging. Those desires are not shameful. They are human, but when answered by illusion, they lead to chains. The echo of Paris is that human longing must be met with truth, not deception, with endurance, not shortcuts. The modern world, too, carries its illusions. New substances, new technologies, new promises whisper of liberation and brilliance. But history reminds us to look closely, to question what lies behind the glitter. The story of 1920s Paris is not merely nostalgic. It is prophetic. It asks us to see our own age with clarity, to recognize the shadows behind our lights, to confront the silences that conceal ruin. And yet, amidst reflection, we must not forget the beauty. Paris in the 1920s was truly brilliant. Its art, its music, its literature, its energy, these endure, not as illusion, but as reality. The heroin that shadowed it did not erase its brilliance. It only deepened the poignancy of memory, reminding us that beauty is fragile, that joy is precious because it is fleeting. The brilliance of Paris shines still, not despite its shadows, but alongside them. As we close this story, let us imagine Paris at twilight. The lamps are lit, the cafes alive, the sound of jazz drifting through the air. Couples walk arm in arm, writers scribble in notebooks, dancers prepare backstage. It is a scene both real and remembered, both past and present. The brilliance glows, the shadows linger, and together they form the truth of history. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to join me on the next journey. We have wandered together through the streets of Paris in the 1920s, from the glitter of Montmartre to the silence of the Latin Quarter, from the chandeliers of aristocratic salons to the weary rooms of the working poor. We have seen the brilliance of jazz and dance, the fever of champagne, the dreams of painters and poets. And we have seen the shadows that followed close behind the quiet spread of heroin, the chains of dependency, the absences that marked decline. The story of Paris in those years is not simple. It is not only a tale of glittering brilliance, nor only a chronicle of ruin. It is both, woven together so tightly that neither can be separated from the other. The City of Lights dazzled the world with its creativity, yet beneath its brilliance lay silence and sorrow. The legacy of heroin reminds us that every age, no matter how radiant, carries shadows, and that silence can be as destructive as excess. And yet, it would be wrong to remember only the tragedy. Paris endured, and from its brilliance we still draw inspiration. The novels of Hemingway, the dances of Josephine Baker, the music of Sidney Beckett, the paintings of Picasso, all of these remain alive, carrying with them both the joy of creation and the memory of fragility. Even the unfinished works, the silenced voices, the forgotten names are part of the legacy. Their absence is a reminder that beauty is fragile, that creation is never guaranteed, that every gift must be cherished. The lessons of Paris belong not only to history, but also to us. Each generation faces its own illusions, its own temptations, its own silences. Each must decide whether to confront them or to conceal them. The story of heroin in Paris asks us to look closely at our own time. What are the illusions we pursue? Today, What are the silences we refuse to name? And what brilliance might we lose if we fail to see clearly? As we leave behind the Paris of the 1920s, let us carry with us both its beauty and its shadow. Let us remember the laughter of Montmartre's nights and the silence of its mornings, the courage of artists who survived and the absence of those who did not. Let us honor both brilliance and fragility, for together they form the true story of the City of Lights. Leave a 1 if you are still awake. And don't forget to subscribe to join me on the next journey, for there are always more stories waiting in history's stories of brilliance and ruin, of light and shadow, of humanity's endless search for meaning beneath the stars.